Welcome back, everyone. It's been a minute, but I'm excited to be back and refreshed and better than ever. I had some things come up in my personal life. I had to help my family just finalize some things in helping my grandparents move in with them, and that's really the big piece of it. But I've also been doing some research behind the scenes. I've still been plugged into the sport, and I wanted to make some changes to the channel as well. So we're back now. Thank you for tuning in, and if you haven't already, make sure to like the stream, subscribe to the channel, and also hit the notification bell so that you can get notified when we go live and when we talk college football and provide daily content for you. So also, down below, let me know who you think the top programs in college football will be in the future. That's what we're going to be talking about today. That's what we're going to be discussing first, are the top 15 programs in the future, the top 15 programs of the sport. There's just a lot of things that are baked into this, looking kind of at I would say 2-year rolling window of wins in the college football playoff, wins against the top 10 teams, and also my perceptions of in-game coaching, development, scouting, and recruiting. I'm now trying to put that forward and trying to project how that will pan out over the next 2 years, maybe if I need a tiebreaker, looking a bit beyond that. And there is a key assumption baked into that assumption being we're not going to get enforcement on NIL or on tampering, or that basically assuming the wild, wild west is going to continue for the next 5 years. That's my projection. I don't think you'll get any type of enforcement anytime soon. There's an episode that hasn't dropped yet, but will by today or tomorrow. I've just been so busy I haven't gotten to it. I recorded it with Chris Drew. He has a lot of insights through connections he has on the future of the sport, where him and I talked over that. But one of my confident predictions about the future of the sport is that it's going to take a while for us to see like tampering actually become illegal, or there be limits on NIL contracts. There's going to be a lot here. So thank you guys for tuning in. Now let's get to it. Let's really kick off this show and get a strong start. So first and foremost, looking at the top 15 programs for the future, using a 2-year criteria, projecting into the future of how I think a program's resources, win totals, college football playoff wins, and wins against the top 10 in power ratings. So whether that's FPI, S&P Plus, whatever power rating metric you use, I'm looking at that and trying to project it over a 2-year window, and also factoring in current coaching staffs and perceptions of in-game coaching, development, scouting, and recruiting. Obviously, for many of these top 15 programs, if not all of them, I'm not expecting coaching changes in the next 2 years, so that could be a flaw in this assumption, and it's very hard to predict the future, especially with the wild, wild west we have right now. But without further ado, let's start off and look at number 15, that being the Iowa Hawkeyes. I had them at 15th in my top 15 programs of the past 2 seasons, and I have them 15th here because I just love their consistency. How can't you love what Iowa has been able to do? Even in the post-Big Ten West, where they originally had some struggles, I think their progression on offense and the fact that their defenses under Parker have still been able to perform at a top-end level are proof positive that they are a consistent program. They are elite at developing and scouting. They do lack that upside that you would want in a top 10 program for sure, but we're judging the top 15. These are teams that should consistently be able to contend for the college football playoff or flirt with being top 15 in power ratings. And Iowa's stability also comes into play here. They haven't lost more than 5 games over the past 5 seasons. They have won 10 games in 2 of those. Last year they went 9-4, and look, they played Indiana, USC, and Oregon down to the wire. They played Iowa State when healthy down to the wire. they were able to beat Vanderbilt in the bowl game. So I think Iowa, as long as Ferentz is there, is going to be one of the top programs outside of the national title contender space. They're going to be one of the top programs in that next tier of the sport. We have Texas A&M at 14th. My logic behind Texas A&M taking a bit of a step back, because I did have them in my top 10, is that their schedule was easy last year. It was pretty manageable the year prior. And I do like Elko as a coach, and I love their resources, but I just think I have questions about how good was last year's team and how long is it going to take them for them to get back to the college football playoff with some of the coaching questions they have. Look, they promoted, Holman Wiggins to be the offensive coordinator, and he has not really been a play caller before. They promoted from within on the defensive side of the ball as well, where it sounds like Elko is going to continue to call plays. A&M was quietly a paper tiger last year. They were a good team, but not a great team. In power ratings, they were actually much closer to Iowa than anyone who received a bye. And that's backed by a variety of factual evidence, that's backed by film, that's backed by their FPI efficiency and FPI scores that are displayed up here on the screen. So that's my question with A&M. I think they're a good program. They're in a much better situation than they were under Jimbo Fisher. But do I expect them to take that next step with how loaded college football seems to be? I don't exactly know, and at this point don't think so. At 13th, we have LSU. A huge part of this is the Lane Kiffin factor here. LSU has a abundance of resources, so that's a check right there. They have national title contender resources, which in the NIL era isn't exactly a given in the SEC anymore. They have the portal master, so scouting, check. I love how Kiffin scouts his rosters in the portal, and he has done a good job at developing, let's be fair, even with players that he's recruited out of high school or helping players transform from where they were at their prior stop to their current stop. Why I don't have LSU in the top 10 is I do think there's a reason why Kiffin is pleading for patience here. Kiffin is also not exactly a excellent, outstanding in-game manager. That's why 2024 Ole Miss, who was probably the second or third best team in the country, lost to Kentucky, Florida, and LSU that year, and all their coaches were fired, a year after that. He does a lot of things well, also does a lot of things poorly. And I think that at the end of the day, in-game coaching and being able to be a master of things is what's going to require any program to be in the top 10. So if you're not a top 10 head coach, and as of right now I don't have Lane Kiffin as a top 10 head coach, then I'm probably not going to have you in the top 10 programs, with rare exception. A coach who is in the top 10, whose program I don't have in the top 10, would be Alabama. And that's because I think Alabama is lacking some things on the resource side here. Now, what do I mean by that? What do I mean is NIL. In the Big Ten, they would not be spending at the caliber of Oregon, USC, Ohio State, and Michigan. And there might be other schools that could be spending at their level. You are seeing this with some of these SEC programs in recruiting, where despite them being located in the states with the most talent, and therefore they'll get a hometown discount. I think that's a pretty logical assumption there. Their recruiting rankings are slowly going down, and their rankings in the portal aren't exactly good either. Georgia, you could say, is an exception to this because Georgia's focusing a lot on retention, and I trust Smart in that program. I do trust DeBoer, but they didn't do a good job retaining talent. They didn't do a good job in the portal. And I think their NIL is lacking. They're still recruiting at a high level. I think that DeBoer will help them punch above their weight class when needed. But there are questions about, how consistent are they at beating the teams that they should beat? And look at the recruiting. Look at the FPI efficiency, the FPI score, which those aren't all meant to be compared year over year. But you can see when you track all these things in a trend line, ever since Saban left, and really ever since a year or two before Saban left, things were trending down even before he left, and they're certainly trending down now. So I have skepticism in a world where NIL is going to become more important and spending is going to become ever more important. Same with scouting for the programs that can't spend at the top. I'm skeptical of all those things about Alabama, pretty much outside of in-game coaching and in-game management. So I have questions for the Crimson Tide. 11th, before we get to the top 10, we got Tennessee. I love Tennessee's outlook. The only reason I don't have them higher than this is they have just had questionable things come up every year. It's been the defense every year except for 2024. And in 2024, it was the offense. And last year, the offense was kind of a paper tiger. That's what happens when you score 80 points per game against FCS competition, and you don't necessarily factor that out of your metrics. That's why we love teamrankings.com here, is they factor out stats against the FCS. A team like Georgia usually plays down to FCS opponents and kind of uses it as a practice. Tennessee uses it as a sounding board, and that can manipulate data, especially in a power rating service like FPI, for example. But I love Derek Owings as the new strength and conditioning coach. I love Jim Knowles as the new DC. The questions I have for Tennessee are about, can they get some of those big wins that they've been craving? They got the 2 against Alabama. The last time they played Alabama in Neyland twice, they beat them. They nearly got Georgia last year, but they do not have that signature win, and they do not yet have that, physicality and that development of the top-end programs. Tennessee right now is a program that is teetering to be outside of the top 15 with how they finished last year. So I'm putting a lot of faith in them as a program and their staff to be fringe top 10 in the next 2 years. Whole lot of faith in Josh Heupel and Derek Owings, and it's really just Derek Owings and Jim Knowles, if I'm being honest. I think Heupel's a good coach, but top 10 coach, I could not say that with confidence right now. Entering the top 10, we got the Texas Tech Red Raiders. I'm going to keep it short and sweet for Texas. They dominate the Big 12, so they'll always be in the college football playoff. Check. They understand the meta for winning. That's why they're spending the way they are. They're trying to recruit these freaks on the inside. Elite defensive line last year. They'll have a great defensive line at minimum, could also completely reload and be as good as last year's D-line, and they're recruiting well on that side. The key to winning it all is having a elite D-line, but especially elite defensive tackle play, and they understand that. So that's a check. What holds them back, in my opinion, is the fact that we do not know how they're going to perform in the postseason yet. Texas Tech last year was a lot like Indiana the year before. A lot, where they had an easy schedule. They were able to beat up on teams. A lot of Indiana's had to do with the fact they were better schemed and disciplined than you. A&M was pretty disciplined last year, and they were also just more talented than everyone they played. So when they got to the playoffs, they got punked, and they kind of looked like a top 15 team playing a top 5 team instead of a top 5 team playing a top 5 team, like many computer models thought Oregon versus Texas Tech would be. I do think they'll get a playoff win in the next 2 years, if not maybe 2, maybe more than that. But there just are so many other teams that I think have a better head coach at the top. Even if they don't have better resources, I can count on many other programs having better in-game coaching. And keep in mind, Texas Tech still has to build up from a recruiting angle. And while Indiana just did what they did, winning it all with the 72nd best roster, I kind of think they're a big exception to the rule there. Tech's getting close to recruiting at that level. That really isn't what holds them back in my rankings. A lot of it has to do with the fact that I am skeptical of Joey McGuire as a head coach. I'm somewhat skeptical of their offense after seeing what it was last year, and playing easy schedules all the time can sometimes bite you in the butt. Looking at number 9, we have USC. My biggest reason for putting USC in the top 10 for the future is this number 1 class. The fact that they are bringing back the most starters in the nation for this season, and many of the starters they're bringing back this year, they will be eligible to return the following year, too. So you're going to have probably 2 seasons in a row of just stacking returning production and experience on top of each other. I'm starting to get a feeling that Gary Patterson was also the right move at defensive coordinator. I showed a lot of skepticism to it early, similarly to what I did to Matt Patricia with Ohio State last year. And while I don't think that Patterson is going to feel the defense like Ohio State's last year, that would be insane. I'm getting the feeling that, he invented the 4-2-5. He knows what he's doing, and he doesn't have to be a head coach. He just has to be the head coach of one half of the team, or a little bit less than that when factoring in special teams. So when you have that much talent that USC does, and they've clearly made strides, and clearly since 2023, which I think was their worst team under Riley, not less talented, but just worst performing, most inconsistent, least deadly. They've kind of trended up since then, and they've become more physical over time. So I think this is going to be a good year for USC. I think 2027 is likely going to be a fantastic year for USC once that class has a full season to develop. At 8th, we have Michigan. Now, if I were doing a 5-year outlook for Michigan or a 10-year outlook, they would probably be lower, because I don't know if they have top 5 NIL right now. I know they have the capability for that, as most top-end Big Ten schools do, but are they actually spending there or willing to spend there? It's a question. And Kyle Whittingham's definitely a short-term option. So 5-10 years, now the coaching stability factor, really, really shaky. But he is a top 10 head coach, could be top 5. He's in that range. There's no doubt that Jay Hill is a great defensive coordinator, or that Jason Beck's a great offensive coordinator. Michigan's also been recruiting at a top 10 quality level, and they're top 25 in returning production this year, and probably will be top 10 in returning production next year if there isn't a disaster season. And I don't think that'll happen. Michigan this year tracks as a top 15 to top 10 team. Again, remember, with the recruits that they have, if they have a good developmental staff, they're going to be a top 15 power-rated team, if not top 10. With the Wolverines here, their biggest problem for the past 2 years has been coaching. They had one of the worst coaching staffs in all of America. Now they go to at least a much better coaching staff, could be one of the better coaching staffs in all of college football. The schedule's tough, but when I look at total wins and try to project those, I try to adjust for schedule. Michigan won't be a national title contender this year unless everything goes right. But much like USC, I'm looking at 2027 and thinking, yeah, you're going to be bringing almost everyone back. It'll be year 2 in a defensive system, year 2 in an offensive system. I really like what Kyle Whittingham has to provide to Michigan as a program. I think it is a good fit, and Michigan has the purchasing power to make moves if they feel like they need to make them. At number 7, we have Notre Dame. There is a bit of a jump from Michigan to Notre Dame. I think that would be pretty obvious. The Irish, what they have going for them, much like Texas Tech, is a easy schedule. They also know how to recruit well. I wouldn't be as confident in their scouting as Tech because they haven't had to use the portal a whole lot. They're much more developmental than being able to identify key players and pluck them out of the portal. When you look at their portal class this year, a lot of it is banking on the talent of a lot of unproven transfers, with the exception of like DJ McKinney, who's fantastic, and betting on their own development to put them in positions to win. I find that to be interesting because on O-line and D-line, I trust them there. At receiver, we'll see. But CJ Carr's fantastic. They're recruiting at a high level. Freeman is a great coach. I think he's a bit overvalued by some, but he's certainly top 10. So top 10 coach at a blue blood program with a lot of resources, and I'm nodding my head a bunch because that usually results in a good outcome. And you can see the trend line since his first year there. They have been trending up pretty much every year. This is the year where they have to be all in because they're going to lose a lot defensively after this year. Carr could even go to the NFL draft, and with how they've used the portal and how they've recruited, they are much more of a recruiting program than a transfer portal program. So this is the all-in year. I have them at 7th because, well, I think they're going to be a good team this year, and by good I mean, top 5 caliber. I don't think they're going to win it all this year, and I don't exactly know how they're going to look this year. So out of the programs right now who I would place as the true national title contenders, which would be Notre Dame and on up, I have them at the bottom just out of, well, I would say skepticism of what they're going to do this year, mostly, and how they're going to reload next year. I don't exactly know, because to reload the following year, I think would go a bit against their identity in terms of, in order to reload now, you pretty much have to ace the portal and use the portal, which they've used selectively, and they've done a good job at it. But I have more trust in, say, a Miami, who I have at 6th, over a Notre Dame. And Miami, I don't think will be as good as Notre Dame this year, but I think the following year, and with how they have a proven track record of acing the portal and doing well there, they will have a better shot to be a top program over the next 2 years, or maybe third if we're looking at a tiebreaker, than Notre Dame. What they were able to do in that playoff run last year, I would argue, was more impressive than what Notre Dame did the year before. That also has a bit of a factor in what I'm doing here. I think that Miami's way of getting to the title game, where it was all about trench dominance, and they were able to do it against a variety of teams with good receivers, teams with great quarterbacks, teams with more questionable quarterbacks, teams with fantastic defenses, teams with, a one-dimensional defense like A&M's, or teams with questionable defense like Ole Miss, and how they nearly beat Indiana, I think is more impressive than what Notre Dame did the year before, where they got a lot of, I would say, even more favorable matchups than what Miami did. Miami also has an abundance of resources. They scout well in the portal. They recruit at a high level. They, much like Notre Dame and Texas Tech, will pretty much always be in the playoffs every year because of their schedule. There will be a few years where they miss, as that happens with almost every program, and will be going forward. But they're going to be in they're going to be in that conversation for sure. And just a quick look at their 5-year program trend. It is one of the more extreme trends you're ever going to see, going from that all-time low almost in 2022 and nearly winning it all last year in 2025. Entering the top 5, we got Georgia. I had Georgia at 4th in my top 15 programs right now. I'm moving them down to 5th solely because of my questions about their resources. Out of the top 7 teams, top 7 programs of the future, I think you're looking at Georgia as having the worst resources here in terms of NIL spending. I think that USC, Michigan, and Texas Tech, so out of the top 10, Georgia would probably be 10th in resources here. What they are not lacking in is coaching. I would put them top 2 in coaching. I would probably put them top 2 or top 3 in development. Like they are so good at so many things, but not always having that easy schedule. So you're not always going to get to the playoffs, or maybe you will with Kirby Smart. It's the same thing with Ryan Day and Ohio State in that program, and probably for Indiana as well. We'll get to those teams later. But Georgia's resources hold them back in a pool with multiple strong candidates that are as good as them, or almost, or in some cases even better at the other things, and for certain have better resources. I still think Georgia's going to compete for SEC and national titles. They'll probably win multiple SEC titles. They might win the next 2 SEC titles over the next 2 years. And I like their odds to win it all this year and next year. They are so undervalued by the public. It's insane. But again, these rankings don't just factor in wins. They factor in, resources, coaching, recruiting, a lot of these different things. And Georgia aces a lot of them, but so do the teams ahead of them while having better NIL spending, and that's going to matter more and more and more as the years go on. At 4th, we have Texas. Texas, from a performance standpoint on the field, I probably trust Georgia to perform better than them over the next 2 years. But it's harder to predict performance, I would say, than predicting resources. And Texas right now is a better recruiting program. They have done a better job in the portal. And as the spending level continues to rise, the average spending level per program, as that continues to rise, the gap between a Texas and, say, an Alabama or Georgia from a recruiting and purchasing power angle is going to continue to widen, and that means that Georgia and Alabama will have to outcoach Texas at an even greater level to compensate for that. And that is hard to gauge because donors and superfans, who are like ultimate loyalists, are less likely to change over and switch sides or retire, I would say, than coaches, because donating is as simple as sending money to your program as long as you have money. And for coaching, it's a lot more stressful of a job. So it's a pretty long-winded way of saying that Georgia on field over Texas on field, but Texas's upside over Georgia's upside. And when looking at programs down the road and in the future, as the top of the pack, which is probably like 4 or 5 teams, separates, which is a prediction I'm making, eventually that resource edge is going to translate to a potential on-field edge, or at least matching the on-field performance of teams with better coaching. It's a huge year for Texas and Steve Sarkisian. I do trust them to reload next year, even when losing Manning, because of what they've done in the portal before and what they will do in the portal. We have Ohio State at 3rd. They, I think, just finished the peak of the Ryan Day era, as we know it so far. Not to say that they can't peak again, but I think that Ohio State from 2022 to 2024 or 2025 just fielded multiple teams that could have easily won it all in a row. Georgia had that from 2021 to 2023, and they won 2 of them. And then in 2023, you're basically a few plays away. Ohio State was a few plays away in 22, 23, and 25 from winning it all. In 24, they win it all. Now, last year, I was foolish in thinking that Ohio State would miss the playoffs for much of the preseason. In August, I switched my prediction last minute, for which I am thankful. I think that gives me a little bit of a credibility save there. I did pick them accurately for all their regular season and postseason games, except for Miami, though. So in several big games, I was able to back them. I'm backing them here because to be a top 3 program over the next 2 years means your odds of winning it all are very, very high. Your odds of winning the Big Ten are high. To be a top 3 program in my rankings means I am picking you to definitely win multiple playoff games over the next 2 years. They have alien players. They have elite talent. They have a top 3 coach in Ryan Day. And when you look at the trend line, it's literally a plateau, but a plateau at the top. You can't get better than Ohio State has recently. You cannot do that. You cannot get better than this. You can't. Maybe in an individual season you can, like going 16-0 instead of 14-2, or having, fewer 2-loss seasons. But that's really, really nitpicking, especially in an era where no one can field the perfect team. Everyone is going to have flaws. The reason I have them at 3rd, ironically, is, look, questions about resources. Are they going to spend as much as Texas, as an Oregon, as a Texas Tech? Because that will matter. Like Georgia and Ohio State have better coaching than everyone on this list, except for one team, and we'll get to that team. But for some of these other programs that they're competing with, they do not necessarily have the purchasing power. Like, they don't have the purchasing power of Oregon or the purchasing power of USC. So as that tracks, and as now they've lost, back-to-back-to-back historic classes by their standard, not just by college football standard, because Ohio State's historic every year by college football standards, but by Buckeye history, they have just lost back-to-back historic NFL draft classes. I think it might be wise, while the betting arena has them number 1, like they did Georgia entering 2024, to maybe expect at least some minor regression. When looking at the top 2 programs, these are teams who I'm pretty confident in the next 2 years will be in the national title game or win it all. We have Oregon here at number 2. For Oregon, it's the fact that when I look at their recruiting, their scouting, what they do in the portal, what they have been able to do at a I would say a top 10 game level, I think they're better than Texas. I think they're better than Notre Dame. And those 3 are the next programs that many are looking at to be your next Ohio State or Georgia, or to win it all after Indiana did. Those are kind of your next 3. And people will eventually include Miami in that. But I don't think people are taking them quite that seriously yet. I am, but I don't know if everyone exactly is. Oregon has had back-to-back classes that are number 1 in average rank per recruit. They have killed the portal every year with the exception of this year, where they still made some pretty good additions. The reason I don't think they were super aggressive in the portal this year is I think they have proof of concept of development. They were such a young team last year, and yet they played at a high level and were the third best team in America, only behind Ohio State and Indiana, playing a lot of young guys. So strength and conditioning, much like Ohio State, Georgia, and Indiana, that is a check, and probably like more of a check than the other programs that are contending to win it all. Defensively, they fielded their best defense under Lanning and returned plenty of those starters. So they probably should have their best defense again under Lanning this year and surpass last year. They returned Dante Moore, who they helped develop after at UCLA didn't have, such a hot year there, such a hot start. I really love Oregon over the next 2 years to win it all. And if you want to extend that out to 5, I really like them to probably win it all like once or maybe even twice over the next 5 years. They have it nailed when it comes to evals, when it comes to recruiting. In-game coaching has some questions. It's more questionable than Georgia's, Ohio State's, or Indiana's. But I think they have done a better job there than, say, a Texas or a Miami. I would say as good of a job there as, or maybe better than Notre Dame. And they 58-12. When you look at every year since Lanning got there, they have basically been winning at an Ohio State caliber clip. They're just missing the natty. And it very much feels like after Kirby Smart for years couldn't win the big one. Same thing with Day. It feels like Lanning is up next to be that next coach where he got to a point where 4 or 5 years in, people started really doubting him and saying, oh, well, he'll never win it. And then he just does. And it feels like this Oregon team and this Oregon roster this year or shortly is going to win it all at some point. And the number one program, I think, for the next 2 years is Indiana. And a huge part of this, even though they don't recruit at the level that any of these top 10 schools do, their scouting, their development, their in-game coaching, their staff, that's all number one. And they have a potential power of resources that most schools on this list could not match if the donor base is fully engaged. And they're only getting more engaged over time. When you have the best coach, when you are able to win it all at a high level and go 16-0 with the 72nd best recruiting roster, when you are able to meet up against Oregon twice and physically impale them and look like the tougher team, and that's a tough Oregon team. When you play against a tough Ohio State team who's coming off of an emotional game against Michigan, but they're motivated to win the Big Ten. They want to make history themselves, and you're able to survive against them and beat them with that many first rounders and escape. That's impressive. When you're able to pound Alabama, when you're able to escape Miami, when everything is going wrong that night, your receivers aren't catching the ball, Miami's basically getting away with pass interference, they're hitting the quarterback hard, they're blowing your tackles out of the water within like 0.5 seconds, and you're still able to win. That is the mark of an elite program. Like, they're already here. Right now, I would not have them number one. I'd probably put Ohio State ahead of them, given that over the past 2 years, Ohio State's been power rated higher. They've been more talented. I do think 2024 Ohio State in neutral field beats 2025 Indiana. I do think that. But it's very close. And I think over the next 2 years, with that scouting edge, coaching edge, and look, if they engage their donors, Indiana has a larger alumni base than Ohio State does. So they also have the potential to outspend them in resources too. And they're only going to recruit at a higher level as time goes on. Their scouting, developmental, and staff advantage are just so far ahead of everyone else's that it compensates for some things that they have to get through. Not saying they'll win it all this year. Don't know if they'll win it all next year. But the trust that I have in this program is above the trust I have over any other program, because what we have all seen them do over the past 2 years with what little we all thought they had, or what the metrics said they lacked in. Those are my top 15 programs in the future for college football. This list will probably be wrong, but I very much hope that you enjoyed it. Let me know who your top 15 programs of the future are, or if you have a shorter list, let me know of that too down below. Now I want to discuss early thoughts on the top offensive lines for college football. We all love watching our team's offensive lines, our big men, just dominate and wreck opponents. We love that. We love when our offensive lines, when our team's offensive lines get 10 yards downfield in blocks and put up their arms for the touchdown celebration, or flexing and pushing around their running back or quarterback or receiver when they score. We love that. It is the juice that feeds us when we're watching college football on our TV or in game. And when you attack a team's offensive line more than any other position, that fan base will get defensive, because there's just something about the camaraderie and the winning spirit of that unit that determines so much, and yet is so undervalued. So we're going to look at the top offensive lines, or my early thoughts on the top offensive lines entering the 2026 season. I want to start off with Cincinnati. Cincinnati's returning over 4,000 snaps. Last year, they really helped Cincinnati get to a bowl game when their defense and at times the passing game was pretty pedestrian. I mean, Joe Cotton, Evan Tsengdahl, they were some of the better offensive linemen in the country last year. They are appropriately sized. Their tackles have the appropriate height and weight. Great PFF grades across the board. And look, Taran Tayo, Tsengdahl, who was, I think, a first-year starter last year, and then Cotton, who was a first-year starter at the FBS level, previously playing at South Dakota, I believe, the year before, or maybe, no, it's not South Dakota State, it was South Dakota. They've been excellent, Cincinnati has in the offensive line. That was their best unit last year, outside of maybe quarterback and maybe running back. So the Bearcats, I don't like a lot of their roster. I haven't actually done a ton of research on their roster. One area that I have researched and I am pretty confident in is their offensive line. Georgia returns a heck of a lot from last year, where they had to play Michael Uni at times, and then Dontrell Glover and Juan Gaston were true freshmen last year that had to play. Georgia has this excellent track record on the offensive line. They've still recruited well there, even with some of their minor recruiting drop-offs in other areas. And just with the sheer amount of experience, like Ernest Green III, Drew Bobo, Glover, and Gaston, they were all starters last year. They bring back 4 out of 5 starters, and this was a good offensive line last year. Keep in mind that Georgia didn't exactly have like the perfect collection of receivers, and they didn't have some of the weapons that, say, an Indiana or an Ohio State or an Oregon or even in some regards a Texas had. And this offensive line was really good in, I think, power situations, in gaining short yardage. Look for them to try to emphasize more explosivity on the ground, and look for them to be maybe, I would say, the best unit on offense outside of maybe quarterback or running back. They're strong there, but the offense is going to have to pick up a bit from what they lose at the receiver position. Iowa loses a whole lot, but man, the past 2 years, their college offensive line has been fantastic. Whether it was with Caleb Johnson at running back or without Caleb Johnson at running back, I have been impressed with them. Trevor Locke is an All-American caliber tackle, and I think Cade Piper is going to slide right in at center after playing at guard and do pretty well there. Jack Dolzer, Trent Wilson, Leighton Jones, you got some questions there, I would say, but looking at the past 2 years and the fact that, again, they literally do not have receivers. Iowa does not have power four worthy receivers outside of maybe Reese Vanderzee when he's healthy and the quarterback sees him and he's somewhat open. They have had little to work with. And this O-line, I saw it against Indiana. I saw it against Oregon. They had to put their team on their back. They were able to do just enough to create some drives against top 5 defenses and ultimately come away with maybe a moral victory if that exists. If not, they played it very close and gave it their all. Indiana. Now, Indiana last year was pretty bad in pass blocking. I was deceived briefly thinking that they were elite overall. Look, they were elite at run blocking. I will defend that. But they were kind of the inverse of the Ohio State O-line the year before that won it all, where Ohio State in the playoffs was elite at pass blocking, and the run blocking was disguised by the fact that Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson may have been running back number 1 and 2 that year. For Indiana, the pass blocking was disguised by the fact that Mendoza has legs. He's big, he's hard to bring down, and he also is able to identify defensive coverages pre-snap, and that plus RPO gives him extra time, the RPO does, and identifying coverages means he knows where to put the ball or has a great idea of where to put the ball right when he gets it, so he doesn't need as much time in the pocket as other quarterbacks did. Carter Smith and Ademola Ajani will have to step up unless Josh Hoover is all of a sudden as good as Mendoza or better. What I trust is Drew Evans, Bray Lynch, and Joe Brunner. I think this run-blocking unit is going to be as good or better than last year. I would definitely expect the pass blocking to get better since they return their 2 starting tackles, and Indiana's coaching staff is just like, it's up there, and their O-line coach is a proven commodity, proven coach there. They have one of the most veteran O-lines in the country, and I don't know if they'll be number 1. I think they'll be number 1 probably in the run game. What's going to determine how high they are in the top 10 is the pass blocking. That's what's going to determine it. We have Michigan. Michigan is kind of on the fringes here. Really, it came down to, I think, kind of Cincinnati, Michigan, Ohio State, and Texas Tech were that final 4 outside of the top 8, and I wanted to include 2 of them. And really what it came down to, and why I left out Ohio State and Texas Tech, and why I brought in Cincinnati and Michigan, is Cincinnati and Michigan were doing well in the run game and okay in the pass blocking department with nothing else on their roster. Like, yes, Sorsby's a talented quarterback, Underwood is a talented quarterback, and Michigan also had talented running backs. But those teams did not have very good receivers, and their defenses weren't that good. So there was a whole lot more pressure on those O-lines to succeed, where Texas Tech and Ohio State could pretty well hide their O-lines weaknesses, especially against lower-end competition, where their defenses and skill units could just take over. Same with their coaching. So Michigan in particular, with a much better coaching staff, with the talent they have here, I wouldn't project their O-line right now to be top 5. I'd need more research to see that. I'm not as confident in it as I would say a Notre Dame or an Indiana or some of these other units. But look, Andrew Sprague is a potential first-round tackle in his future, and the rest of the line is talented enough where with a new O-line coach in Jim Harding, they're going to do well. And I would expect Michigan to have one of the best rushing attacks in college football this coming season. If the receivers pan out and Underwood pans out as a thrower, you could also see them have one of the better passing attacks too, because I do not think pass blocking is going to be an issue for this unit. I think Michigan's issues have a whole lot more to do with almost any other position except for the offensive line group and maybe the starting running back core. Notre Dame, they have the deepest O-line in the country. Is it the most proven with how injured Jagasaw has been and with how limited in action Will Black has been? No. And Ashton Craig's a good center. They have some new pieces here. But Joe Rudolph is a top 5 O-line coach at the worst. Could be the best. He's, competing with Alex Mirabal and I would also say Alik Terry in that department from Miami and Oregon respectively. Would love to see Bostad be mentioned in that category, but I think I need to see at least another year of him before putting him up there, though he's contending with, that whole Indiana story last year. Notre Dame being in the same state of Indiana, though, missing the playoffs last year, but they're bringing back so much, and they have been able to recruit and nurture offensive linemen from a high school standpoint unlike anything we've seen. They've kind of lost that moniker recently of being O-line U, but this O-line is deep enough where under Rudolph's tutelage, they might regain that this year. That's how much I love this Notre Dame offensive line. I think that this tackle group, if Will Black pans out, and I think he will, CJ Carr is going to have all the time in the world, especially against that schedule, and returning some talented players in the inside if Jagasaw can stay healthy. Maybe the loss of those 2 alien running backs can be somewhat alleviated by better offensive line play. We have Oregon up next. Oregon's the team that I'm probably giving the most benefit of the doubt to on this list, given they lost their 2 tackles, they lost possibly a first-round guard in Emmanuel Pregnon, but they've lost over and over and over again and have still been at the top. over and over and over again. They have, and that's whether they've had injuries to their receivers, whether Dante Moore, like at the start of last year, mid of last year, had some struggles with pocket awareness and was a bit shaken, I think, after that Indiana game. What I like about this new offensive line for Oregon is that I think Fox Crater and Michael Bennett are more prototypical tackles than Alex Harkey and Isaiah World were. And that matters. That's going to matter for pass blocking. Oregon, Indiana, and Ohio State last year all had the same problem where they were basically playing five guards in the offensive line. Indiana schemed around it the best. Oregon had the most talented and best sized unit. They were able to get probably downfield the most when they were able to execute at a high level. So Indiana's was the most disciplined. Oregon's was the most talented there. Ohio State was probably had the worst situation of both in terms of the scheme they were running and also the fact that they weren't as talented as Oregon despite being more talented high school-wise than Indiana was. I think Oregon from a player standpoint and trying to get a true 3 interior, 2 exterior linemen is probably doing the best out of the 3 right now in figuring that out. Indiana, love what they have there. But I think it will take bringing in some new guys to get true tackles there. They can improve, and I think they will. Same with Ohio State bringing back what they do. But Oregon has done such a good job reloading and scouting and recruiting on the offensive line year over year over year. We have Tennessee up next. Tennessee's pretty veteran. They were kind of in that, maybe they shouldn't be inside the top 10. But David Sanders last year played pretty well. They bring back a lot of players in that position. And I think that just another year of continuity and Tennessee's offense under Heupel's really actually predicated on running the rock. And they improved on that after 2024, where with the schedule and the defense, they were a bit of a paper tiger. I think they should make some improvements again this season. I'm curious, though, because, again, there's a lot of teams on this list that could have been left out in place for Texas Tech, in place for Ohio State, teams that also return a lot, but I'm just skeptical of them after what I saw last year. And we also have Texas here to discuss. The Longhorns should have the best pass blocking O-line. Gooseby, I think, is my favorite tackle right now. I'm pretty high on Sprague. I'm pretty high on whoever Oregon's best tackle ends up being. I'm actually pretty high on Carter Smith, even with the criticisms I just gave of Indiana's pass blocking O-line. But I love Gooseby. I think Gooseby's tackle 1 in the next draft after this one that's going to take place in a week or so at the time of this recording. Siani is also a top-end tackle. The interior with Brandon Baker, Connor Robertson, Lawrence Seymour coming in from Western Kentucky, I do like that unit too. Now, I'm more skeptical of this unit than I am of many of the others we just talked about because of what happened with them last year, where they were horrific and almost unwatchable. But I love the construction that this unit has entering 2026. So with what they did in the portal, they, unlike some other O-lines last year that had some issues, like Tech, like Ohio State, like even at times Oregon, though I think Oregon was much better than Texas last year, but they still had some issues. Tech went in the portal and they got some or Texas went in the portal and they got some top tier guys to fill in and even some depth pieces to make sure that they don't have some of the issues they did last year, even if they suffer injuries. And finally, we got USC here. USC was so good last year when healthy on the lines of scrimmage. That offense was probably the most disciplined and consistent Lincoln Riley offense since his 2022 unit. Elite receiver play, fantastic system QB play, and Maeva got better as the year went on. And this O-line, again, when healthy, they did not have a lot of depth, but when they were put together, man, they just did a good job of getting to the second level. They did a great job of pull blocking. They did a great job getting downfield, and they protected Maeva. With how much they bring back this year and with how they've recruited there, and I think they're finally nailing that developmental piece down a bit, Like Elijah Page, for example, has all the necessary tools to be a really good tackle. And Killian O'Connor, a walk-on, was a great center last year. It was tragic that he was injured for basically half of the season. I like what I see out of the Trojans on the offensive side. They also, not to talk about D-lines too much, that's a different video, but if they nailed defensive line too, as Patterson's been hinting at, maybe they could have one of the better lines of scrimmage in all of college football. Those are my early thoughts on the top offensive lines for 2026. Let me know what you think, and if you think I should have put Texas Tech or Ohio State on here instead of some of the other teams that I did. Now I want to talk about the top defenses for 2026. Talking about them, and then really getting into some questions that we have for some teams that we're going to be discussing today. Last year, Ohio State, Indiana, and Texas Tech were the most dominant defenses in the country, and many of them put up generational performances, whether numbers-wise or on film, whether Ohio State's plethora of alien players or Indiana forcing a turnover at every turn and winning it all with mostly their defense and having a historic run defense, or Texas Tech forcing turnovers and, 1, 2, 3 steps back and your quarterback's on the ground because David Bailey's in his face. Who are going to be those caliber of defenses this fall? Well, I do have a decent idea. I at least would like to think I do. And we're going to go through 10 of them, just like we did the offensive lines. Alabama's the one to start out. The Alabama Crimson Tide, the grades are for this year, kind of what I'm projecting. The stats were from last year, just to clear up any confusion. Look at these nice spider charts here. I love spider charts. I'm going to try to use them as much as possible when appropriate, when we can do some of these longer videos. They were pretty much above average, average or good everywhere. That really translates to a great defense because it's hard to be good at everything. If you're good at everything, you're not just good, you're great, because someone who, say, is more specialized at something is lacking in another area. So when taking averages, Alabama last year on the surface, you might think, wow, that's not a top 10 defense. It was certainly a top 15 unit. At the end of the year, it was playing like a top 10 unit. The offense is what cratered Alabama last year in their toxic, cancerous inability to run the football that I can't even comprehend. I hated watching this team last year because they couldn't run the football at all. But we're talking about the defense here, and Kane Womack has done a great job, I think, modernizing Alabama's defense from where it was at the end of the Saban era, which was a bit lacking, to upgrading its schematics. The problem has been at times the players have dropped off. I do believe Alabama this year will not have the roster it did last year, but the secondary should be better. I would expect the D-line actually to be a bit better. The question for this unit's the linebackers. If they pan out at linebacker and they hit on those players, this could be a top 5 defense and a defense that contends for being the best in college football. Georgia is up next. Now, you look at Georgia's unit and how it kind of looks like Pac-Man if Pac-Man's top beak got crushed or broken, if the top of his mouth did. Their issue was sacks and takeaways. They for the life of them, could not get to the quarterback. And when you don't have a perfect scheme, or you don't have a fantastic secondary, or you don't have a fantastic run stop D-line. So Ohio State, for example, in 2023, they could not get to the quarterback to save their life. But you also couldn't run on them. You couldn't. And they had they had pretty good corners. They had reliable enough linebackers where they could tackle in space, and they had a pretty good safety room. Not as good as when Downs was there, but it was pretty good. And they had a top 5 DC. So they would often put you in third and medium, third and long, and they just get you off the field. Or when the field compressed and it was harder to find open receivers, they'd force you to kick a field goal or try to go for it. Georgia, because of the new situation of college football, where it is so hard to hold on to top-end talent and so hard to have depth, they got hit hard at parts of the secondary last year where it was rough at the beginning of the year. And that, combined with an inability to get to the quarterback, killed them in games against Ole Miss the first time, where the offense saved them. And the second time, the offense and just the overall I think composure of the team was a bit more off. So even though the defense played better, Chambliss, because he had an amazing game, they just couldn't stop him with the type of pressure they were trying to get. And Chambliss was able to avoid it when they did get pressure. My question for Georgia this year, I do not have questions about the D-line. I think they'll be at least better at getting to the quarterback. They'll be fantastic at stopping the run. Love their linebacker situation. Corner and safety is going to determine how far this defense goes, because I don't think they have the ceiling at edge to be a 40 or 50 sack D-line like what they had in 21 and 22. If they're going to be an elite pass defense, a lot of that's going to have to come from the secondary, not just from the pass rush. Iowa, for example, last year, they were just a little bit better at getting to the quarterback and a little bit better in forcing turnovers. And look at like how much more complete their defense was than Georgia's, with probably half of the recruiting talent. Iowa, just with Phil Parker, year over year over year, fielding these excellent defenses that are fundamentally sound, that have weirdly fantastic and athletic players to the recruiting profile they have, and that are just so frustrating to play. So frustrating to play. I mean, think about Oregon and Indiana last year. These are teams that hung more offensive points on each other than they did against Iowa, pretty much, or as much. And those were top three teams in America. Only Ohio State could hold a candle to Oregon and Indiana. Only the Buckeyes, who sadly didn't play. It would be entertaining to see like Iowa against Oregon last year, Indiana last year, and if they played Ohio State, that would have been entertaining to see. Hey, all these teams have played at Iowa, or they've played Iowa, because Iowa at home is different than Iowa on the road, and they'll tell you that. Anyway, though, they do get Ohio State at home this year. They don't play Indiana or Oregon, though. The D-line, with how much they lost, both some to the portal, also to the draft, like losing Aaron Graves is huge. That's where they're going to need to reload at. This could be the best corner duo in America. I trust them to reload at safety, as that's Parker's specialty along with corner, and they return enough at linebacker. Even with the departure of LeVar Woods, I also think their special teams unit is going to be really freaking good. For Indiana, they are my number one defense for this fall. I couldn't name a number one O-line for the fall, although I think Notre Dame is the deepest there. But I don't know about number one because starters are more important than depth if they stay healthy. Indiana, I'm confident in saying right now that's my number one defense. They have the players in the D-line not to be a 50 or 40 sack unit. Maybe they could get to 40, but they won't be a 51 or they won't be one that approaches 60 if they play 16 games. They're not going to be a 21 or 22 Georgia D-line. They're probably not going to be even a 2024, 2023 Michigan D-line or 24 OSU D-line. But they could be if everything pans out. I just don't know if I'm going that far. In terms of run defense, though, last year, they only allowed 4.3 yards per rush. And a lot of that had to do with like a garbage time run by Oregon and some explosive runs by Colton Joseph, with Old Dominion. In games where things were close, except for maybe Singleton's long run against Penn State, where the ref basically set a pick for Singleton in that game, just really weird moments. Indiana's run defense, outside of basically those 4 plays, was perfect. And they're returning 3 out of their top 4 linebackers from last year. They're returning their Amari Farrell, they're one of their starting safeties, and they're bringing in Preston Zachman, who is good when healthy. And their D-line will be deeper this year. And it will be better, especially at D-tackle. It'll probably be as good as last year's D-end core, but it could also be better. They're bringing in players that are usually taller, longer, and bigger than last year. So if they buy into that developmental process, and if Indiana scouts them well, they should be better at edge too. Corner, they got to get worse at because Pons is a freak, but Pons and Sharp last year may have made up the best corner duo, along with probably Notre Dame with, Christian Gray, who Christian Gray's good. He's not great. But then Leonard Moore was cornerback 1 by a mile last year. He has everything Pons does, but then he has the physical attributes, like the height and length, that Pons lacks. So therefore, he's better. Measurables should be used as a tiebreaker when looking at players. That's something I hate about how people talk about Pons. Oh, he's short. Well, Pons outside of Leonard Moore was better than you at basically everything the corner position requires of you. And I can't even say that because I'd have to watch more of how Leonard Moore tackles or how he hits, because Pons was probably the hardest hitting corner last year, and I would have him as corner 1 in the draft. So you can't reload there. But at safety, they could. Linebacker, they should. D-line, they will. And special teams, they will as well. So, I mean, just look at the spider chart here. This is the most complete spider chart of any team you will see that we talk about for these top defenses. Even more so than Miami's, who, look, they had a top 5 defense to end the year. Miami's question is all about the linebacker core, a lot like Alabama, but D-line-wise, they're an A+ like they were last year, but the drop-off will be noticeable because they had the number 1 D-end group, and I think D-tackle they're just going to be the same at, maybe a bit deeper. I like what their secondary shows, though. Bringing back O.J. Frederick, bringing back Ethan O'Connor, they might have the deepest secondary in college football when you look at how many snaps and how many reps they have and how they rotate. But that is going to be an area of concern here is, like, look, you lose your biggest non-negotiable defensively. And that non-negotiable being your 2 DNs. Like, you lose Mesidor, you lose Ruben Bain, and I don't think with how good they were last year that you're just replacing them. Like, sure, Marquise Lightfoot could maybe come close to Mesidor. He's not as good as Bain. But what about Damon Wilson? Like, I don't think Damon Wilson is as good as those two. I don't. I think there's a reason he's been moving around schools. It's certainly a contender for being one of the best defenses for me. They were amazing in opponent points per play. They were amazing at getting to the quarterback. They shut down Indiana's offense. They shut down Ohio State's offense. But I wonder if, while year 2 in the system could help, what about the personnel? What demands are there? Notre Dame, man, I love this defensive roster. They were a inconsistent defense last year, and I think what helped them a ton was after their first 2 games, they had a very favorable lineup. So NC State, Boise State, Navy, Stanford, Syracuse with a 3rd-string quarterback. I will give them credit for doing well against a good Arkansas offense, though. I will give them credit for that. USC at home, I mean, USC the following week only scored like 21 points on a bad Nebraska defense, so I don't quite know about that. They were, at the end of the year, a good defense. They were probably a bit statistically inflated because of all the turnovers they have, some of the pick sixes they had, and the poor strength of schedule quality. I mean, their strength of schedule was barely top 50 last year. I do think that roster-wise, this might be the most talented defense. Might. I would probably right now peg it behind Oregon and Indiana in terms of like how I enjoy looking at the 2 deep, but it's close. D-line, excellent. They might have the best linebacker group in all of college football. It's an A+ for me. They have the best individual corner in college football in Leonard Moore, and they probably have the deepest corner room and probably the best corner duo in college football as well, especially if you count DJ McKinney as a corner. The question for them, really, I would say, is like Chris Ash in big games last year, especially when you factor in that, like, yeah, they held USC to 24, but USC on the road also, like, was very inconsistent in every aspect. In big games, the defense is what lost it for him. And even in the Miami game where they held Miami to 27, Miami did not call a great game. That was their first game with a lot of new pieces. And look, I mean, they were like Notre Dame's offense, when you factor in how good that Miami defense was at the end of the year, was still able to, produce big plays. They were still able to pass the football effectively. That's going to be the question is, does the talent translate directly to being a top 3 or top 2 defense, or is the talent held back by scheme? I think that's what it is. Ohio State, they had the most talented defense last year by quite a bit. Their one problem on defense was turnovers. They did not force turnovers. This was a defense that Ohio State as a team overall reminded me a lot of their 2023 team, where they were not as talented defensively as this team was, but analytically they were very similar. You could not move the ball on them. They were actually better than Michigan until they played Michigan. They were better than them in terms of allowing points per play. It was kind of insane. And that was with them playing a tougher schedule than Michigan. They were a bend but never break defense. That was what 2023 Ohio State was. They would bend, they would sometimes give up points, but they would never, ever break. Even on that final drive against Michigan, which took forever and did not help Ohio State at all, they eventually forced Michigan to kick a field goal. And that was after a super long drive where Michigan just kept finding ways to get first downs. This defense was elite. It was historic. The one issue was turnovers. And because Sayan under pressure last year also made mistakes, the lack of forcing turnovers and the proclivity in big games to at least give up one of them, Indiana and Miami, the only top 10 FPI teams Ohio State played last year, that basically explains their losses right there. They forced less than a takeaway per game. That's something that has to improve this year, because while I do have everything graded at an A or higher, I love their safety duo. I actually think corner for Ohio State will probably be at the same level it was last year. I think Sanchez will have a huge breakout season. Linebacker is going from an A+++ to an A. There's going to be a big step back there, even if it's one of the best linebacker groups in football. It's just not going to be that freakish or talented. The D-line, I don't know how you replace Caden McDonald. They could get better at D-end, though. This is definitely a top 10 defense. Could very well be a top 5 defense. All these teams I'm talking about, I almost certainly have as top 10 defenses and will be competing for the top 5 spot. They have to get better at forcing takeaways, though. The bend but don't break, worked last year. Oftentimes they just got you off the field. That's how good that defense was. Just, okay, 3 and out, punt, offense takes over. If they did give up yards or a first down initially, they'd eventually get you off the field or force you to a field goal. That defense was one of my favorite defenses to watch. I envied those players just because they were doing everything right, and I'm a perfectionist, and that defense, man, was just perfection. Peak perfection. A lot like Indiana's, just with some more freakish players, and a lot like Texas Tech's. Oregon's was probably that next defense up, I would say. This season, I love their D-line, their corners. I think safety with Coy Parrish has a chance to be better than it was with Thieneman and Flowers last year, because Flowers is entering his second year starting. Linebacker would be their one area that's a bit questionable, but talent-wise, in theory, it actually could be better. Given Betcher was a walk-on, he's a great player, but they do have guys that out of high school are more freakish, so if they develop them the same, they'll improve there. Oregon's problem was once opponents got into the red zone, they pretty much always scored a touchdown. They were also a team that struggled at times to get pressure, despite having the talent they did in the D-line. I don't know if that was schematic. I don't know if it was because their tackles, along with Tatum to Ioti, are bigger, so they're more run-stop defensive line than pass-rush defensive line. It's kind of like the inverse of Miami's. If you could run on Miami's D-line if you ran up the middle and blocked their tackles properly. And with Oregon, some teams that had questionable pass blocking were able to lock up those defensive ends pretty well or delay them getting to the quarterback. I think that'll be changed this year, as I do expect Chris Hampton to be an upgrade over Lupoy as a play caller in exchange for Lupoy's recruiting abilities leaving to Cal, where he's the head coach. This is my number 2 defense. So you've heard it here first. I think Indiana and Oregon will have the top 2 defenses in college football this year. Oregon is the most talented D-line. They have the deepest D-line. The question between them and Indiana for defensive line really comes down to is Oregon's talent developed as well as Indiana's? Because if so, then Oregon has more talent, they'll be better. If IU's much better at developing or scheming their D-line, than Oregon, well, then they're going to be better. And I can't quite confidently say that without further research or even seeing them play on the field. But I love Oregon's defense. I think it's going to be the bell cow of this team. And while I do not predict 2026 Oregon to be 2021 Georgia, or which was Lanning's last defense and best defense at Georgia, I think this team will be the closest to that Georgia team that Lanning has, and that's definitely what Lanning is modeling his program after, is those great Kirby Smart teams that he was previously the DC for. Texas is also a contender here. Their question is safety. Other than that, I think that their starting defensive line, starting linebackers and corners are among the best. Depth is also an area where I think they lack experience outside of the starting lineup, but they're so talented and bring back so much that I'm not concerned about that, unless you're talking about who the number one defense is or who's going to be competing for the number one defense. So Texas, even with my skepticism of Will Muschamp, they're stamped as definitely being one of the better defenses in college football. If there's one thing they got to improve on, it is, again, that safety position. When Taff was injured, Texas's man coverage last year was a bit exploited. And while they have Colin Simmons, I think you saw this in the Ohio State game last year, where, like, look, if you're putting Saraveld and Simmons or Phillip Daniels and Simmons just one-on-one, Colin Simmons is blowing them apart 10 times out of 10. But since Texas really only had that one lethal pass rusher, Ohio State, by moving the pocket, by using heavier sets to bring in extra blockers, and by being more careful with the football than Texas was, and better on defense, they were able to win that game. With Texas, you could see that happen with Ohio State again this coming year, or again in other games on their schedule if they don't have someone opposite of Simmons to take the pressure off of him. Having two near elite DNs is better than having one phenomenal defensive end. And I think the perfect example of that, in terms of looking at like NFL draft capital and those different things, the perfect example of that is Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau in that defensive line in 2024 compared to Texas's defensive line in 2024, which was deeper at defensive tackle, and Simmons was probably the best end on the field, maybe not college-wise, but NFL-wise. And Ohio State had the better pass rush and the better D-line because having, four near elite guys coming at you is much more intimidating than having, saying, one elite guy and three good. Because D-line, much like O-line, maybe to a lesser degree, a lot of that is a team unit, is a group effort in a group unit. Finally, we got Texas Tech. Texas Tech, I think, again, is going to have this fantastic pass rush that teams are just going to have a headache trying to deal with. Love linebacker and corner and safety as well. I think they're going to take a step back at linebacker from last year. Corner and safety, I actually expect to improve. How well they reload on D-line will determine whether or not this defense is as good as it was last year. They were they were interesting, to say the least, last year. So their pass rush among Ohio State, Indiana, and Texas Tech, for example, those are the top three defenses last year. Indiana's was the most disciplined, and they're the most disciplined. They were the best schemed. They had the best overall D-line. So they didn't have a Caden McDonald like Ohio State did. They also didn't have a David Bailey, but they, because of their discipline, scheme, and their starters staying healthy and being explosive, they were the best performing D-line. So that, on top of probably having the best performing corners out of the group, that with their DC and their best discipline helps them be in that conversation, despite not having as many NFL freaks as Texas Tech or Ohio State did. Tech was second in freaks. Ohio State was first. Indiana's weakness was talent and lack of top-down depth at the end of the day defensively. Ohio State's was turnovers. That was really their only weakness there, was turnovers. And occasionally, like against Miami, going with Patricia's bend but don't break defense like plays into a team who's willing to only get 4 yards per play and roll with it. Tech's weakness is they could allow big plays. They could get a bit too like big play happy and give some things up. Their pass defense was a bit inflated by how good their pass rush was, but they had the best overall pass rush, especially when you factor in what their linebackers did and how like Romello Height and David Bailey were probably the best D-end group outside of Akeem Mesidor and Ruben Bain Jr. Love them to reload this year. Let me know what your thoughts are on the top defenses for 2026. Thanks for watching. Now we can get to some interesting questions that we have for different teams. We went a bit long on those segments, but not to worry. That's okay. Trying to limit myself to really only taking like 2 hours, maybe preferably an hour and a half. But today, since I wanted to go live yesterday and couldn't, I'm willing to go around 2 or a little bit more than 2 to get all of Monday's stuff into this week. We want to ask some questions, though, around college football for a variety of teams. And to start off, we're going with Ohio State. What are some questions for Ohio State entering 2026? What are positions they need to reload at or hit on, or areas that might be concerning or carry skepticism with them? Well, right now they're the number 1 program in college football. I think we know that. We know that Day and his coaches, whether that be Larry Johnson, whether that be Carlos Loughlin, James Laurinaitis, Matt Guerrieri, Tim Walton, we know that, I think especially on the defensive side of the ball, they have elite coaching acumen, and Day also has elite offensive acumen. And they bring back 60% of their production. They recruit and develop at a high level, so they're mostly going to reload. These questions surrounding Ohio State are pretty much going to be fairly cosmetic. It's going to be, are they going to be a top 2 team, a top 3 team, 4, 5? Probably the lowest you could go. I think the lowest you could rank them is 6th. I have them a bit higher than that. They're somewhere in between the best team in America and the 6th best team in America. And that's pretty much the case for anyone inside the top 6, I think, with the exception of like maybe 1 or 2 teams. Ohio State here, they were number 1 in EPA per play last year. They were number 1 in success rate margin. They were top 2 or 3 in everything else. Their biggest weakness last year was running the football. And I know that against Miami it was also pass protection, but Miami, to be fair, did that to pretty much everyone. They, whether it was to the dreaded right side of the O-line or to the, better but not elite left side of the O-line, they could not run for crap. Whether it be missed assignments, that was a lot of the time when looking closely at their O-line, whether it was the fact that their O-line just couldn't get across the line of scrimmage and they weren't strong enough against better defenses they played. Bo Jackson was really the unsung hero of the ground game as the season went on. And he, along with some weaker defenses they played, and the passing attack, covered up a whole lot of issues on that offensive side of the ball. The defense, the only question about them is just how much will they reload. The defense was perfect last year. You couldn't ask them to do anything else except maybe get more turnovers, and maybe if they try to do that, well, maybe they drop off in some other area. You can't have, a 100 out of 100. It's just, it's nearly impossible, if not totally impossible. But this was such a fantastic team last year, and I think the season was a success. Now they have to build on that, and with a tougher schedule and some changes, they have to adapt, and they have to make sure that parts of their team improve to compensate for the inevitable drop-off at, say, linebacker, where they might be losing 2 top 5 picks. That's just insane. It is the O-line for Ohio State. That is their biggest question. They were not good in run blocking, and I would say they were above average in pass blocking. I think that the pass blocking at the end of the year probably got too much heat, just not understanding how good Miami's defense was, not understanding how good Indiana's defense was, because entering the year they weren't viewed as that top end, and Miami struggled enough in the regular season. Indiana still had their, bad brand logo to where people didn't take him as seriously as they should have. Miami killed Indiana in pass rush in the national title game. They did. They got Ole Miss too. Chambliss was just able to evade it. And they also killed Marcel Reed and A&M, who had a good O-line last year. So Ohio State's pass blocking, I think, is a bit overhated. It wasn't great, but it was above average. It was good. Against Indiana, pretty much all their rushing yards came after contact, and that just shows how good Bo Jackson is. But that's not ideal, especially with the schedule that Ohio State faces this year. And now taking into account that Jeremiah Smith comes back and the receiver room probably is deeper, but it doesn't have the same upside without a Carnell Tate. So what happens if Sayin needs more time in the pocket and the O-line isn't better against a tougher schedule? That could mess everything up. It's why Ohio State brought in Arthur Smith. I don't exactly understand why they brought everyone back and didn't go into the portal. I understand that there aren't a ton of good portal offensive linemen, and I do think Ohio State's O-line has a higher ceiling than they showed last year. The question is, will they get there? Can they get there? Believe me, the Ohio State's running backs and quarterback were probably better than people thought at the end of the year, and the offensive line, as much as some Buckeyes I talked to have defended it, probably didn't catch enough heat. If they just have a 2023 O-line, which had some ups and downs but was more talented and came along at the right time against Michigan, they probably win the national title. If they had the 2024 O-line, playoffs, or pre-Simmons injury, they win the national title last year with that defense and with that receiver core. So that's the biggest question. That also comes into play with the rushing offense, but with Bo Jackson, even though he's out for the spring, I do think that he is going to be even better. I strongly believe that Lachlan is Ohio State's best position coach. I right now would probably tab him. I would probably tab him, or maybe... No, it would be him. I would tab him as the nation's best running back coach right now. Cedar inherited an elite running back room at Notre Dame. I need to see post Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price. Lachlan had Henderson and Judkins last year. Did a good job with them, helped Henderson improve in, I would say, like contact rushing, yards after contact. And look, I mean, Bo Jackson was one of the best running backs in the Big Ten, maybe the best running back in the Big Ten when it was all said and done last year. So I have faith in him to make this running back room better with all the experience it returns. And saying he's not going to be running over people, but if he just scrambles a bit more when there's wide open grass, that's going to help the rushing offense and help the offense overall. So I don't have as much concern about that unit. Does Arthur Smith mesh with the Ohio State offense is another question. Much like the rushing offense, I don't have a huge question about that. The question about Arthur Smith, the rushing offense, and the next question I ask are just, to what scope does that work out? So does Ohio State's rushing offense improve by just a bit, or does it improve by a lot, or somewhere in between? With Arthur Smith, we know his play calling is going to be better than Hartline's just because of his experience. The question is, does the roster he have, combined with the schedule he has, and the fact that they're not going to have 2 first-round pass catchers, they're probably just going to have 1 this year, does that cancel out his improved play calling? If not, how much more talented is the offense under his tutelage? So that's my question there with really the offensive side of the ball. And then moving on to the defense, I don't actually have many questions about the defense. It's funny because Ohio State returns a lot more on offense production-wise than defense, but the defense was so much better. I think so much better than the offense last year. And that went over people's heads until the postseason. And I think the defense has better position coaches. And they have the best coordinator of the two. So ironically, what you have, and this is funny because it's a lot like Georgia, for the past few years under Kirby Smart, on average, has had better offenses than defenses, despite him being a defensive coach. Now, Ryan Day in Ohio State, on average, over the past 3 seasons, has had a better defense than offense. It's kind of funny how that works. I think they'll reload as best as they can at D-line, whether that means they get better or a little bit worse. They're not going to get more than... They're not going to regress more than just a little bit on the D-line with what they return there. Love Kenyatta Jackson, love Zion Grady. I think they did enough in the portal there to add some depth. They might be deeper there, this season compared to last season, but I don't think they'll have a McDonald. Safety, they'll reload as best as they can with Downs' departure. Terry Moore lost his black stripe. Earl Little Jr. lost his black stripe. I love Jalen McClain, Leroy Roker. They're set there. The question for them is linebacker, because that was their best position last year. That's also the position that Patricia's scheme meshes with the best. That determines how good his scheme is, because it's so linebacker focused. If they have, say, a massive drop-off at linebacker, where they go from number 1 in America to outside the top 10 or outside the top 15, then the offense is really going to have to improve if this team wants to win it all. If they just regress a little bit, and they're not going to be better or the same as they were last year, like, no disrespect, but this coming season, Riley Pettyjohn nor Peyton Pierce are going to be top 10 picks if they were eligible to be drafted, because Pettyjohn won't be. He'll be a sophomore. But if they can come close to that and say the other positions come close to reloading, you'll get maybe a top 5 defense, and that combined with expected offensive improvements can be enough for this team to be number 1 in the country and go on a postseason run in the college football playoff. Those questions, look, those are mostly cosmetic, and a lot of them are nitpicky. Same with my questions for all of the other top programs. Ohio State right now being the best program in the country. They're going to have the most first-round picks. They are NFLU right now, and that's because they're great at scouting, recruiting, developing, and putting their players in a position to win. So the questions here are just whether or not they're going to be the 5th best team in the country, the 1st best team or the best team in the country, or somewhere in between that. Let me know what your questions are for Ohio State down in the comment section below. Please let me know. I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts. Now we got some questions for Michigan. Just read the comment section to see what people are saying. Cool. Yeah, someone in the comments talking about how it drove him, the legendary Romeo, an Ohio State fan, it drove him nuts that Sayan never attempted to scramble, especially against Miami. Yeah, that was insane. I mean, it wasn't just the sacks he took against Miami, but the size of the sacks, where he took sacks that were like 10 yards behind. He kept drifting back in the pocket instead of trying to go side to side. And I understand, because it wasn't just the DNs that were getting to him early. I think I remember the first play Ohio State took a snap against Miami, and like it was either Gabe Van Sickle, Jake Cook, or Luke Montgomery, like one of their guards, and within a second he was 2 yards behind the line of scrimmage. And I thought to myself, yeah, I think my pick of Ohio State to cover's over, just off of that one play. It was like, whoa. Like, these aren't even the DNs that are getting there. It was the D tackles too. So the only place he could go was back. He couldn't go to the side. He'd get sacked. If he stepped up, he'd probably get sacked too. It was so wild. And then when he was able to scramble, whether against Indiana or whether against Miami, he was so gunshot and so shocked from really occasionally getting touched, because either he was able to find guys deep, or his O-line did a good enough job for enough snaps where like some plays were there, if you get what I'm saying. But anyway, just replying to some comments. Make sure to comment your thoughts in the live chat. If you want me to have a guaranteed response to something you're saying, make sure to send in a super chat. Let's move on to some other questions for different teams. What are some questions for Michigan entering 2026? They've come off 2 years with horrific coaching, and it's been so frustrating because you know the talent is there. With Whittingham and Beck and Hill, the head coach, OC, and DC, I don't think there are questions about coaching here, but there might be some questions about the roster, whether how good a position is going to be, or if there is an area that really has a dire concern. Let's take a look at these questions here and tell me what questions you have for Michigan in the comments section. Please, how many yards will Bryce Underwood throw for? How will Bryce Underwood function as a quarterback. Is he going to be a top 10 quarterback? Is he going to play to his ceiling and maybe be top 5? Is he just going to be kind of nice but inconsistent again and be a top 30 or top 25 quarterback? Does the defensive front concern you? Let me know some answers to those questions or any questions you have down below. For Michigan, they were just a above average, maybe good team last year. Talent wasn't the issue. Coaching, play calling, discipline, and execution were. I cannot say how many times against Nebraska it frustrated me where Michigan was so close to making that a blowout, and due to a stupid penalty or a blown assignment, they were able to allow Nebraska back into that game. It was so frustrating. That game should not have been close. And if Michigan even had Terry Smith as their head coach with that staff, or you switched Penn State and Michigan staff, it wouldn't have been that close. Just wouldn't have been. And Terry Smith, all respect to him, love him as a person, love him as a coach. He's not a head coach. That's just how bad Sharon Moore was. It is how bad of a coach Sharon Moore was. Not a good motivator, not a good game planner. He was having a bit too much fun with his third organ there, or third hand or third foot. Like whatever. That sounds super wrong, but whatever. It was a bad situation. There are better days ahead for Michigan. That doesn't mean they don't have questions, though. The biggest one is their overall talent, and whether or not their recruiting talent is actually how good their roster talent is. So recruiting for a lot of people is a hill to die on. That's not what we do on college football with Sam. We put it in its place where recruiting is super duper valuable. Recruiting is a lot like IQ. IQ is a variable of how intelligent you are. And it certainly correlates because, you have a higher IQ, usually you make more or you have a better job. And there's other behavioral things that match with that or track with it. It is a proxy to intelligence, but not a perfect one. Recruiting is the same thing with how good in actuality your roster is. It is a proxy. It is not perfect. So Indiana, to put in perspective how insane Indiana was last year, Indiana going 16-0 is like if someone with an IQ of 50 ruled the world and made good enough decisions and was smart enough to do that. Like it's such an outlier that either someone got something wrong or someone got something wrong, or it's just not a fluke, but there's just something special there that you can't account for yet. There is an undiscovered variable. You didn't measure the IQ wrong, you didn't measure the proxy wrong, but there's just all these other areas that are so good that you haven't measured, that what you measured doesn't accurately describe what's going on, if that makes sense. It's probably a pretty long-winded answer. With Michigan, it is fair to say that the awful development of the past 2 years may have stunted parts of this roster. So even with much better coaching, there is a chance that Sharon Moore and Wink Martindale just did such a bad job developing that it might take a year or two for things to settle in and for Michigan to actually be able to play to the capacity of their roster. It's a bit of a weird question, but when you look at the depth chart and how much Michigan's losing and some of what they're bringing in and how many young guys they have, how quickly these young players are going to be receptive to this new coaching and how much there is to unlock from them by this coaching staff is really going to determine the season. Like if Michigan is underrated by the recruiting services in terms of the players they brought in and now they have elite development, well, this team could win it all. Say they were a bit overrated and say maybe I'm overrating the staff or there's just not a cultural fit and they could be 7-5. So that's a big determining factor here. Bryce Underwood is the other question. Asked it at the beginning of this segment. There were moments where he was so good last year, and others where he was so bad. The bad parts have to end because the schedule's tougher. You're not exactly going to be playing 2025 Ohio State every week. I mean, Ohio State last year was the most talented team, but let's be honest and say that, like, that's a rivalry game. It was at home. I think Ohio State early on did have some jitters with how Michigan was able to run the ball with some explosivity and the turnover from Sayin. Like, that game could have been worse, and it wasn't. And Ohio State liked to play slow, which was to their disadvantage. You're going to be playing teams next year that are close to that in talent and maybe have a better matchup against you or even have a better game plan for defeating you. For example, you're going to be playing multiple teams that are close to that level next year. Oregon, Indiana, Ohio State again, maybe not as good as they were last year, but they're on the road. So in terms of a point spread, you're probably going to be a bigger underdog unless you get much better. Iowa's not going to be a pushover. Oklahoma is not going to be a pushover, even though they're at home. Penn State, you're going to have to play them, though thankfully at home. It is a tough schedule, and with some of the questions the defense has, it was quietly a pretty mediocre unit last year. Underwood's going to have to take a real step forward and be a top 15, top 10 quarterback if this team wants to win 9 games and improve from where they were last year. Wide receiver development is another area of concern with J.J. Buchanan coming in and how Andrew Marsh played last year and Michigan bringing him back, which is huge. I don't have a lot of concerns here. It's not as big of a question as how good Underwood will be, or not nearly as big of a question of, what's the overall roster build here? How good are these players in actuality, since we haven't seen a lot of them or we've seen them in limited action and they've, some of them looked horrific, but they also had horrific coaching. So were they just bad players or were they poorly mismanaged? I think that Michigan will develop pretty well at receiver this year, and this will be Michigan's best receiver room of the 2020s. I was almost going to say the 21st century, but nope. Braylon Edwards, a lot of the Lloyd Carr teams. 2016 Michigan may have even had more talented receivers than this Michigan team did with some of the players they had. But, man, Michigan's offense, if things pan out, is going to look really stinking good, and I have a lot of faith in the offense, actually. Some of my bigger questions are with the defense. Michigan only returns one starter, Trey Pierce at defensive tackle, in their front six in the 4-2-5 scheme. So, I mean, look, the front six last year wasn't all that good. I think a lot of that was coaching, but they also had some talent there, and like Derek Moore, had over 10 sacks, but in the big games didn't show up all that much. Again, I think a lot of that was coaching. I think if he were under this staff, you'd be looking at a possible All-American. And John Henry Daly does transfer in. They have a lot of talent and some guys like Eno Etta coming back who were in the rotation last year. But that really ties back in with the overall talent question. If Michigan, say, is just lacking at talent on the defensive line, then it'll be like Utah last year, where it doesn't matter that you have a good DC or a good defense overall. Eventually, when you play a team like Indiana, who I think is really good at running the ball, they're going to figure out, why are we going to put our worst tackle against John Henry Daly and let him try to get to our quarterback? We're just going to run against you because you can't tackle us and can't block us there. If that happens, then Michigan's ceiling is really, really capped. If the front six turns into a strength, then Michigan's ceiling might even be limitless. And then the defensive rebound, that's a very general question. It's actually the question I'd be the most confident in answering if I were Michigan is yes, this defense will rebound. They were 37th in defensive efficiency. Jay Hill's last 2 defenses with far less talent were better than that. And there's enough of a similarity between, the schemes that Martindale ran, the scheme, the Ravens defensive scheme, and what Jay Hill is running that I think the players will acclimate to this very quickly and benefit from this better staff. Again, let me know what you think about Michigan entering 2026 down below and what questions you have for this team. Now moving on to Indiana. Potentially the one bad thing about going 16-0 is you can't improve off of that. And Curt Cignetti was talking about that in spring about, how do you improve after 16-0? How do you, keep your head straight? How do you maintain once you've reached this level? And I just think, sticking to your principles and not tolerating mediocrity is the key to that. And for Indiana, coaching is not going to be a question with them ever. They're already up there, I think, with your Georgia, your Ohio State in terms of coaching, and your Oregons and Texases in terms of programs and success. But that doesn't mean they are without questions. Let me know what you think some questions are for Indiana down below. Do you think pass blocking on the offensive line is a big question that needs to be answered? What about Josh Hoover and his turnovers? I think that Dykes was an idiot for, criticizing his QB, who will be better than whatever QB he has starting this year, and he probably had something to do with that, but it is a valid thing to point out. So let me know what you think about Indiana and what concerns or maybe questions in a good way you have. And by that I mean maybe there's a position that you think is untapped upside and you're wondering how that area could pan out. They were the best performing team last year, the Hoosiers were. I think that's pretty obvious. They went 16-0. They finished at the top of all efficiency metrics. And they did it without being the most talented team. They didn't have the same freaks that Ohio State did. They, from a recruiting standpoint, were inferior to Oregon and Alabama. They beat Oregon by double digits twice, and they beat Alabama by 35 and held them to 3 points. I mean, I mentioned it earlier in my Michigan question segment. Indiana was such an outlier in terms of winning it all, and this is how crazy it is. It would be like if someone who tested a 50 or 60 on an IQ score, which that person couldn't function as an adult, was not just functioning as an adult, but they conquered the world, were ruling it with an iron fist, and created a utopia. That is how insane of an outlier Indiana winning it all last year was. And what that means is either the metric used to determine success, say the blue chip ratio or the IQ score in my analogy, is just totally wrong. You should throw it out. Or if you actually look at it from a statistical angle and you don't overreact, you should say, no, this is still very useful because IQ is an accurate proxy for intelligence. It's the most accurate one we have right now in humanity. And blue chip ratio is one of the more accurate proxies we have for winning it all in college football. Instead, you should look at it and go, this is accurate, and yet it missed very badly. I wonder what this team or this person or program has that we're not accounting for. And what Indiana has is the best staff in terms of schematics, in terms of knowing how to do more with less, in terms of development. They have the best staff, I think, by a good bit in college football. I think that's the best explanation for this. And if not maybe the best staff in some areas, they certainly have the best staff in scouting and development. To be able to get these players out of the portal and have, to have Stephen Daly be able to get pressure on Julian Sayin and at times work Ohio State's tackles, or to have Aiden Fisher be one of the best tacklers in college football, or to have D'Angelo Pons be the best cornerback prospect, in my opinion, for the upcoming NFL draft, and be, your hardest hitting, toughest corner in America last year, to have Fernando Mendoza be the best quarterback in America last year. That takes something special. Just like how IQ, sometimes when it gets something wrong or doesn't accurately gauge someone's intelligence or life, just like when that messes up, when recruiting messed up here, that doesn't mean the system is bad. It means there's just something that can't be accounted for. And for Indiana, that's their coaching staff. So with Indiana more so than any other team, I'm never doubting their staff. They are up there with Ohio State. They are up there with Georgia in terms of those are my top 3 staffs. And Indiana is a good bit ahead of those other 2, in my mind. You can debate me about that. I've had people debate me about that. You will lose because those teams have only ever had access to top 5 players and NFL freaks, and they have never done anything as impressive as what Indiana did last year. You will lose if you debate that point. This staff earns the most benefit of the doubt out of any staff. And you can say, well, they haven't, done it as long as Georgia and Ohio State have under Smart and Day. Yeah, I can say that. I can also say that Ohio State in 2021 and 2023 and 2025 severely underperformed on one side of the ball, and it cost them from winning it all, while Indiana, with like a tenth of the recruiting talent that those Ohio State teams had, just went 16-0. I can say the same thing for Georgia with their defense every year since 2022. They have not fielded a top 10 defense since that year. They've underperformed relative to their talent. Now, look, everyone does that. Even some Saban teams did that. And the fact that Indiana, Look at the metrics on the left-hand side of your screen. First in SP+, first in FPI, first in FEI, first in game control efficiency, second in points per play margin, only behind a Notre Dame team that played a cakewalk of a schedule. That's nuts, what they were able to do. But that doesn't mean they don't have questions. Like I mentioned earlier, I think that Hoover and the turnovers are a question mark. Say Indiana's defense gets better this year than it was last year. I think there's a very good chance of that happening just from a talent angle and what they did in the front seven and some of the portal additions they made if they pan out at secondary. Well, what happens if Hoover is more like a Curtis Rourke than a Mendoza, where he's more of a statue, isn't very mobile, doesn't have the same pocket awareness or running ability, and say, the pass blocking improves, but it's not elite, and the turnovers flare up in big games? Well, Indiana could technically be a more talented team, and yet because they don't have the same clutch QB or same Heisman winner or round one pick one at QB, they lose to Ohio State at home, or they lose to Michigan on the road, or they lose to Washington on the road, or they make it to Indy undefeated but lose that time. And maybe they're like Ohio State last year, where they go 12-2 and just once it gets time for the postseason, teams figure out Hoover a bit. That is a big question. It is, because let me tell you right now, if Hoover is as good as Mendoza last year, Indiana will win it all again, because they're only going to get more talented. They're more talented on O-line than they were last year. They're more talented at D-line and linebacker. They have enough at receiver to somewhat reload there, and it's the same thing at running back. Like, if Hoover is as good as Mendoza or better, they'd probably be the best bet right now outside of maybe Oregon to win it all from like a value and odds standpoint. If he is worse, though, and statistics say he probably will be, we'll see, though. Indiana with Cignetti has pretty much always had top-end QBs, and I think Hoover will be a top-end QB this year. But is he number 1? Is he number 5? Is he number 10? Is he number 15? That's going to determine a lot about Indiana's offense and a lot about their season this year. These next questions are more about the ceiling of a unit rather than am I concerned about it. So I'm concerned about the offensive line's pass blocking, but given how bad it was at times last year, I think it can only get better. So is that really a concern, or is it just a question of how much does it improve? I think it's that. It's like asking a question about Michigan. How much better is Michigan going to get? Because their staff is so much better, and they were so young last year that on paper they should only improve. It's the same thing with Ohio State's offense. With how bad the play calling was at times, with how bad the O-line was at times, it should only get better, especially with Arthur Smith. With Indiana's O-line, do they have, does Carter Smith and does Adedemola Ajani have the ceiling to actually be NFL tackles? Because say if Carter Smith could be a first-round tackle and the rest of the O-line is as good as it was in run blocking last year, and on paper it should actually get a little bit better because of how much they bring back, then who's stopping this unit? Unless Hoover is atrocious, and I don't think that's the case at all. Do they have that ceiling? Because if they have that ceiling, then they're probably going to reload offensively, even though it'll look a bit different. And then if you pair that with the defensive line ceiling, they returned 68 career sacks. They're second there. I think they're only behind Notre Dame in that category. If the defensive line has a ceiling to, say, not be a 2021 Georgia O-line or D-line, because I'm not going to go that far. I mean, I'm not going to doubt Cignetti, but I'm going to say right now, no. I don't think so. But can they have a 2024 Ohio State or 2024 Ole Miss or 2024 Michigan caliber D-line? Because last year was a pretty down year for D-lines. 2025 was. Or maybe even the question is, can they have a Miami talented D-line or an Oregon one of this year or last year? Because if they can with their coaching, then that's probably the number one D-line, and no O-line's going to be able to block them. So then the question flips back to Indiana's defense, and if that question's answered positively, then they probably have the best performing team again, and they might have a more talented team than last year and be even better, dare I say it. Another question, and this is one that I don't have as confident of an answer on, is cornerback play. So Pons is gone. He's off to the NFL. I think someone's going to take a chance on him in the first round or early second round because he's too good. Oh, but what about the measurables? Don't care. He hits hard. He tackles well. Oh, but again, what about the height? Dude, in the red zone, he covered Jeremiah Smith well. And yes, Jeremiah Smith beat him, but Jeremiah Smith beats everyone. Like, the only corner who'd probably fare better against Jeremiah Smith than Pons is Leonard Moore. And Leonard Moore, I mean, that's just God-given ability. Like, he has the height and measurables that Pons does not. And he also plays at an extremely, like, elite generational level. Pons is cornerback one, based on the evidence, based on what you see, I think. When I look at the corner room, I think it will probably be deeper, and they'll be able to rotate more than last year. I love A.J. Harris. I think A.J. Harris is going to be a fantastic player this year and, have a breakout year, rebound after a disappointing 2025. No one in that room is Pons, though. Like, Pons last year was cornerback 1 or cornerback 2 in college football. And some of it probably depends on whether you preferred, what scheme you preferred. And depending on that, you'd go to either in a decision tree, it'd be Leonard Moore, or it would be, D'Angelo Pons, probably. They're not going to reload there. So how far is the drop-off? Is it going to be minimal? Do they have to run a different scheme? Is it going to be severe? And that along with the defensive line likely improving and linebacker being more of a question, but it will probably stay equal, that will determine whether or not the defense is better this year than last year. Indiana, I will say it here publicly, this is the team that I am going to give the most benefit of the doubt to, because last year, the way they won it all, that's not a fluke. That is such an outlier that it can't be a fluke. It cannot be. That's how big of an outlier that is. That's an outlier that makes you question your methods, not say, oh, well, they won a bunch of close games. Well, true, they technically did, but their close games were against teams that all finished top 15 in power ratings, and they had 3, multi-score wins against teams that were top 10 in power ratings. So they won a lot of close games like, say, Georgia did in 2022. Where I think they won 2 or 3 of them, and they were just against good teams. And you can't blow out all the good teams unless you're a GOAT caliber team, which Indiana wasn't. In terms of power ratings, in terms of achievement, they definitely were. Let me know any questions you have for Indiana down below. And again, you might complain about benefit of the doubt, but who else deserves it? Who deserves more than this staff and what they did last year? Now going on to Oregon. When I look at Oregon entering the fall, my question for them, and I think the only question that matters, is talent maximization. Let me know down below if you think there is any other question. Maybe you're questioning whether or not Dante Moore is the guy, as in, does he have that, beast within him that can take over a game? Maybe you have questions about the specific coordinators. Is Drew Maringer or Chris Hampton guaranteed to pan out? No. But I think there is a very broad question with Oregon that will determine their season, and that is talent maximization. Look at how much they did last year. Look how good they were. Their points per play margin was 6th. Their success rate and EPA per play margin were a bit lower, but points per play is what I care about more, because that's like points scored in a given play. That is how you measure offense and defense scoring, by the way, in college football. You measure it on a per play basis, because that adjusts for tempo and possessions and different things of that nature. Like Michigan in 2023 had a very low scoring offense, but if you looked at it per play, or you looked at it from an efficiency standpoint or a busted drive rate, they were a top 10, if not top 5 offense that year. With Oregon, when you look at, again, how good they were last year, their PFF score, FEI, S&P Plus rating, game control, when you look at what they retained and what they did in the portal, Indiana and Ohio State were the best teams last year in power ratings, and Oregon returns a substantial chunk more of top-tier talent than those other 2 teams do. Their question, compared to those other 2, is Ryan Day's won a title. Curt Cignetti's won a title. Curt Cignetti depantsed Dan Lanning twice last year. Ryan Day, from a coaching angle, got depantsed by Lanning that one time in Autzen, but it was only a 1-point win because Ohio State had the much better team. And then Day did Lanning, returned the favor and depantsed him by an even larger margin and a more impressive outcoaching in the Rose Bowl, and kind of in a revenge game where Ohio State then went on to win it all, as Oregon knows painfully. Oregon has, ever since 2023, only lost to teams that participated in the national title game. Ever since 2024, they've only lost to teams that ended up winning it all. That's painful. But let me tell you something. Think about Kirby Smart at Georgia. Who were the teams that, he lost to? Like from 2017 on. Sure, you had Auburn, but they made the SEC title game in 17. Sure, you had LSU in 18 and 19 who won 10 games and then won it all. You had that ugly loss to South Carolina, but that could be a lot like Michigan beating Ohio State in 2024. It's kind of fluky, kind of a weird game. And 19 Georgia wasn't nearly as good as 24 Ohio State anyway. And then in 2020, 2019 they lose to LSU, who won it all. 20 they lose to Alabama, who won it all. They also lost to Florida, who again made the SEC title game and was probably a top 5, if not certainly top 10 team that year. And then in 21 they lose to Alabama, who made the title game, and in the rematch, Georgia beats them. Oregon feels a lot like that next best team, that next best program, that next best coach that's going to step up and they're going to, take college football by the neck and just snap their neck and win it all in very barbaric fashion, much like Ohio State did with the revenge tour in the playoffs, much like Georgia did when finally getting that taste of revenge against Nick Saban. And Indiana, that whole season was just anger and vengeance. Like, you guys doubted us, you're counting us out, and we're gonna kick your rear and show you what business is. Oregon has the capability to do that this year. This is the number 1 roster in college football. They've, for 2 consecutive years now, had the number 1 rank per recruit, and they've developed at a high level. They've retained their 5 stars. They are going to have anywhere from 2 to 3 first-round draft picks this year, and they'll probably have, they'll have 2 on the D-line next year. They could have 1 emerge in the O-line. They'll have Dante Moore for sure. So that's 3 right there. Jamari Johnson could be a first-round tight end, and they could have someone from the backfield of their defense or receiver room go. Like, this Oregon roster could be as good or even better than last year's Ohio State roster. It's a stretch, but it's possible. It's in the realm of outcomes. The question is coaching. You have the talent. Now you got to maximize that talent. You got to maximize its development. You got to put that talent in the best position possible to win. Some more nitpicking questions are passing game improvements. They averaged 0.11 EPA per pass attempt last year, which was outside the top 10. A lot of that has to do with receivers, with quarterback play. They should be better at receiver this year, for sure, and especially if they're healthier, and they had a lot of weird injuries at that position last year. And Dante Moore should improve another year in the system, another year starting. I imagine his O-line will be just as good as it was last year, maybe even better, because I think their tackles are more standard tackles and better pass blockers than the prior group of tackles were. Another question that is really tying back to the first one is the new coordinators. I have a lot of faith in Chris Hampton. I think he will be an upgrade as a defensive play caller. Drew Maringer, though, he's so unknown and has such an unknown background, such a limited background as a play caller, where I kind of don't have a good feeling about that, but I also don't know. Internal promotions and those type of hires don't always work out, but they sometimes work out, especially when you have this much talent. So for Oregon, I think their biggest questions are these that I brought up, but really it's just one question, and that is, can you maximize your talent? Because if If everyone in America had Indiana's coaching staff, or Ohio State's coaching staff, or Georgia's coaching staff, those I think are in a tier of their own coaching-wise, then Oregon would win it all like 9 times out of 10, probably. That's how highly I think of their roster. So can they maximize their talent? Can they win by coaching and talent, not just by talent? That is a big question for Oregon this fall. Texas. That is up next. Just want to thank you guys so much for watching. Really do appreciate it. Make sure, if you have not already, to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Apparently, Iowa is having to vacate victories under Kirk. Oh my gosh, that is so stupid. They're having to vacate wins in the 2023 season due to tampering with Cade McNamara. How stupid. That's so stupid. You know what? I'm going to make a video on this after this live show is done. That is so stupid. That is so stupid. That's breaking news, by the way, via Twitter. That is insane. Just complete madness by the NCAA. Until we can enforce all rules at a close to equal level, you can't enforce any of them at all. Just can't. It is absolute mob rule, and the only reason this is being handed out to Iowa is because they're Iowa, and because Kirk Ferentz isn't going to fight back. He's old school. They're just taking advantage of this. It's so stupid, but whatever. I mean, if all you have to do is let me see the penalties. You get a fine of $25,000, 1 year of probation, reduction in visits, and vacating those wins, and a 1-game. Oh, the 1-game suspension for the 2024 season was already handed out. They just handed out the rest of the penalties. If those are the penalties, then you tamper. It's so incredibly asinine. So incredibly asinine. But let's move on. Let's discuss Texas. Here are some questions for the Longhorns. What are your biggest questions for Texas entering 2026? Are there any concerns you have for the Longhorns, for Steve Sarkisian, for this roster that are non-schedule related? Let me know what you think. I believe, very similar to Oregon, I strongly believe that Texas and Oregon have the best rosters in all of college football. Very similarly to the Ducks, talent maximization is Texas's biggest question. Maybe it's their only question, if you want to think about it that way. Last year was the perfect example of how you have all the talent in the world. You have a top 5 recruiting roster, and your success rate margin, oh man, it was negatives. I didn't even know that, but now I do, thanks to my graphic on the left-hand side of my screen. And they were just a team that really was top 15 when you factor in strength of schedule and when you factor in how they were playing at the end of the year. They were a top 15 team. They were a nice team. They were a great team, but in no way were they elite. They were not. You know, if you placed them in the Big Ten, they would have been the 4th best Big Ten team. They were definitely worse than Georgia last year. They were definitely worse than Miami. Definitely. They were probably at the same level as Texas Tech. Maybe a little bit worse because you'd prefer having elite defense over, elite offense, and Texas's offense at the end of the year was pretty freaking good. Anyway, it was a question last year. So Texas, Oregon, Georgia, and Ohio State were viewed as like the top 4 rosters of the sport entering last year from a recruiting standpoint. Ohio State reloaded, Oregon improved, which was freakishly impressive. Georgia improved by a little bit, but definitely reloaded, and Texas was really the only one of those that took a substantial step back from the prior year. So that's a question entering this season. Like, why were they the only team out of those 4, especially when at the end of the year they had the best quarterback out of the 4? Why? Why did they take a step back? I mean, Manning is going to be round 1, pick 1 in the next draft. And Texas probably will have the best pass-blocking O-line or close to it in the SEC and the country. They have Colin Simmons, who is one of the best pass rushers in America. Rasheem Biles is the same at linebacker. They killed it in the portal. Texas, Notre Dame, and Oregon are the three teams that should have national title or bust-esque expectations. And it's because their rosters are so loaded that to not win it all, especially when the following year you're probably going to regress a good amount, that's not acceptable. It's just not. It's not acceptable. So Texas needs to coach better. They need to develop better. They need to put their players in a better position to succeed. The rest of these questions are pretty downstream of that. I mean, if you maximize your talent, then your O-line transfers will pan out. They're top 25 in returning career snaps with 6,373. And I think Trevor Gooseby right now is the best tackle in the country. If you have tackle 1, quarterback 1, Cam Coleman could end up being receiver 1 in college. I don't think he's going to be receiver 1 in the draft with Smith, but I think there actually is a world where that happens. Keep in mind that Coleman hasn't been developed as well as Smith, and he hasn't had the same QB play, and yet he has put up very impressive numbers and has a actually better contested catch rate than Smith does. I still think Smith's number 1 and the best player in college football, but Cam Coleman's insane. To have those three offensively, one of Hollywood Smothers or Raleek Brown could be running back 1, and then to have Colin Simmons, Rasheem Biles, and to not win it all. I do understand that Oregon probably has D-tackle 1 and D-end 1, and Moore is not going to be as good as Manning from an NFL standpoint, but he could be better in college. DeCorian Moore could be close to receiver 1. Jamari Johnson could be tight end 1 for. I understand Oregon and Notre Dame too also have a lot of these freaks, but especially Texas and Oregon. I think Notre Dame's like in tier 1B compared to those two. To have all of that and not win it all, or to have all of that and not even win the SEC, not even play for a title, huge disappointment. I know some Texas people I trust who help me with this channel. They are very eager to see how the season pans out, especially with the offensive line and the rush offense. They were a bad rushing team last year, and with the transfers they brought in the O-line and at running back and with what they return on offense, you should see a stark difference in the rushing attack. Now, look, maybe you won't. Maybe you won't. And with where it seems that they've prioritized recruiting and development on the O-line, it seems like they care more about pass blocking than run blocking, or outside blocking rather than inside. And that works out with Sark's obsession, rightfully so, with outside zone. I will never forget that game against Texas A&M where they're spamming outside zone, and at first it's not working. But eventually it's like, trust the process. Eventually they start breaking off these long runs, and it just puts A&M in a blender. And that's how, they trailed at halftime, but ended up dominating that rivalry game for a win last year. It was a really fun game to watch. So that's a question for them too, is the rushing offense. And then this also plays into the talent maximization question. Does Will Muschamp mesh? His last coaching job on field was 2023. And look, the 3-4 defense, the front seven, I know college football's returning back to using more tight ends and using more offensive linemen, but with how many freakish receivers and tight ends there are, the meta is still the 4-2-5. That's what Ohio State ran mostly last year. That's what Indiana runs with a bit of 4-3 mixed in here. Georgia runs 4-2-5 mint just out of a 3-4 scheme. So they have 4-2-5 players, but in the Saban scheme. It's what Texas ran under PK when they had an elite defense in 2024, and their defense last year was still great. It's what Michigan ran when they won it all. So what system does he run? Because he likes to go multiple. Does it mesh? Does he maximize his players? And if there is a position of weakness on the team, does he make adjustments to try to take that away? Those are my questions for Texas entering 2026. Let me know what you think about those down below, and ask me any questions you have about this roster. And I can't reply to all your comments, but I'll try to reply to some of them. And I think we have Georgia. Yeah, we have Georgia and Miami left. Georgia, after having a steep regression in 2024, has been trying to adapt their recruiting and developmental philosophy to the 2020s, to the new NIL and portal world. And what that meant last year is they were intentionally young to ensure they could retain a plethora of players they wanted to retain. And now they're older and they're top 10 in returning production entering 2026. What are some questions you have for Georgia? Do you question how they'll reload at receiver? I personally have questions about how big of a step forward their pass rush is going to take. If you want to ask me any questions or answer that question I have, let me know in the comment section below. How many sacks will Georgia get this year? Will it be 30, 35, 40, 45, maybe 50, because they do have a lot of talent there? Let me know. But Georgia, a lot of people in my area, because I'm more of a Big Ten guy naturally, they've been crapping on Georgia for not winning a playoff game in recent memory. And I understand that. But come on, guys. Like, Kirby Smart's a top 2 head coach. When I look at how Smart commands his program and what he does, I can't hate on it. I don't care if people, like, the same people down south who were, like, who were just, drinking the Alabama Kool-Aid against Indiana, or who were, like, practically moaning and saying, like, oh, Alabama because of size is going to beat Indiana. Just because those people also say in the same breath that Kirby Smart is elite doesn't mean both of those things are false. It just, someone can hold a very dumb opinion and a very smart opinion at the same time. Picking Alabama to beat Indiana was one of the most insane things I've ever seen in college football. Ever. I mean, it was tantamount to picking TCU to beat Georgia in 2022, which back when I was much younger, I did. I'm ashamed of that. If I could go back in time and change one thing, that would be on the list for sure. But I've learned my lesson. Rarely pick against Georgia now. That was insane, picking TCU. And so was picking Alabama to beat Indiana. I know I'm on a tangent, and this isn't necessarily related to Georgia, but the point I'm trying to make is that this is one of the staffs that you got to give benefit of the doubt to, and they were still a really good team. Yes, the loss to Ole Miss was disappointing, but you have to put that in with the context of why they lost. They lost because Chambliss turned into Cam Newton, and that combined with Georgia not having a pass rush you would be lucky to win that game. If you are facing Cam Newton and you cannot get pressure and you do not have an NFL defense, then you just have to outscore them, and you have to pray that you can outscore them. And Georgia just, even with a defensive score, they could not muster up enough offense, and they made enough mistakes to where they didn't outscore Ole Miss and they lost. Georgia's biggest question is their ceiling, because they were second in team talent composite last year, and given how little they lost to the portal and how little they lost to the NFL, they probably will be first in team talent composite this year. But they haven't played like that. Last year, like, there's an argument to say Ohio State would have been favored over Indiana in the rematch, because Ohio State was just so obviously that talented that, look, on a different day, they could have beaten Indiana. Absolutely. Indiana was number 1 in all the efficiency metrics last year. That was the most disciplined and best coached team last year, and probably the most hungry team. Oregon played like they had a top 5 roster all year. All year they were top 5 in efficiency, top 5 in the metrics, and they finished universally top 2 or top 3 in all power ratings. Georgia, for pretty much the entire year, was hovering around 10-5, despite starting like second in FPI. They were just, hovering around that. They have not exactly played like a national title contender, and at times at the end of last year they did. The way they depantsed Texas was impressive. The way they killed Alabama was a bit like what Indiana did. Not quite as lethal, but because they were playing a more banged up Alabama, but it was close. But look, if Georgia played Indiana, given the fact that Georgia did not have the pass rushers to exploit Indiana's tackles, Indiana would have beaten them. Indiana, quite honestly, probably would have killed that team. Now that I'm thinking about the roster matchup, like, they beat Alabama 99 times out of 100. They probably beat Georgia like 90 to 95 times out of 100. Just thinking about that. Ohio State against Georgia, bit of a different story, because Ohio State didn't handle their O-line issues as well as IU did, and they didn't have the same quarterback. But Ohio State would have had the roster edge there. It would have taken Georgia out coaching Indiana or Ohio State severely to win either of those games. So where's the ceiling? It's somewhat of a talent maximization question, but not really, because I trust Smart to maximize the talent on his roster. I think the past 2 years have been more about probably bad evals, which happens to everyone, more than anything else, on top of injuries and on top of the fact that, look, you can't have it all every year. You can't. Even if you're Ohio State or Alabama or Saban, you just can't have it all every year, even if you're Georgia under Kirby Smart. It just happens. The wide receiver room has 0 returning starters. So that's interesting, too. Like, you bring back Stockton, you bring back the running backs, most of the O-line, some tight ends, but what's up with receiver? I think Isaiah Canyon is going to be a good player for them, but I don't exactly know that to be the case. It's an educated guess at best, given how Georgia's receiver room has performed recently. Like, it's never been elite. At best in 21 and 22 with, McConkey and Mitchell, and maybe a bit in 23, it was near elite at best. And then 24 was just outright like diarrhea. It was unwatchable. They couldn't catch the ball. They couldn't do anything. Last year they were great and maybe deeper than even some of those near elite receivers. They just didn't have the X factor number one like a McConkey or A.D. Mitchell they had that year, or a Pickens when healthy. The pass rush, that's the biggest question. And the D tackle play too. Now D tackle play, if you look in recent memory, is more correlated with success at the national level than D end play. And that is something Georgia has. They have the elite potential at D tackle play. You saw it with Christian Miller last year. You see it with Elijah Griffin now. But you got to have good D ends. You got to be able to get to the quarterback. You got to be able to generate a havoc rate that's better than 85th in America. You have to. And look, they couldn't get to the quarterback last year. They struggled to create turnovers. The schedule this year is easier than last year, so if it needs time to get there, they have that. But it has to get there at some point if they want to have national success, unless they want to be a huge exception to the rule, which, look, Kirby Smart, along with Ryan Day and Curt Cignetti, those are coaches where they're so good either at developing, recruiting, or coaching, or all of them, that they have showcased exceptions to the rule before. And in general, the pass defense, a huge part of this was the pass rush. But I remember watching the Ole Miss game, and round 1, actually. Round 2, Georgia played better defensively, but worse offensively, and Ole Miss played better in all phases. That's why they won. But round 1, Georgia, Ole Miss, Georgia could not cover worth a lick. They couldn't do it. They got burned in man. The zone got exploited. Whatever they were running, it never worked. And it was always the DBs, whether the DBs missed a tackle, or there was a busted coverage and they weren't in the right zone, or they lost their man. It was so insane. I'd never seen a Georgia defense be that bad in the backfield that they were in the first half of the year. They improved, they got better, and I expect improvements this year, but you'd hope those improvements are maximized from going to good to elite rather than good to, good but a few places higher than last year's good, if that makes sense. Let me know if you have any questions for Georgia. I think my biggest question for them is that pass rush and receiver core. I think Stockton right now is a top 5 quarterback in college football, and I think Mike Bobo is a top 5 OC. People will hate that, but I think it's truth, so I'm going to preach it. The question, honestly, for me, this is funny because everyone hates Bobo and no one hates Schumann. Schumann and that side of the ball is the question, because that's been, I think, the worst performing unit over the past, 3 years when comparing Bobo and Schumann as OC and DC paired together. Let me know if you have any questions down below. And last but not least, we got the Miami Hurricanes for the questions. Oh, gotta stretch. Gotta stretch here. These have been fun. These questions have. They've been an absolute blast. It's been really, really really fun. Bless me. There. So Miami goes 13-3 last year. And they lose 3 first-rounders on the lines of scrimmage. Moinoa, Mesidor, Bain. And now, in the portal, they decide to go all in on receiver, quarterback. I do know they did get Damon Wilson, but Wilson's not a first-round pass rusher. At least I don't think so. And they get more players in the secondary. Quite an interesting strategy, I would say. Maybe that's my one question for Miami. But I want to know what questions you have for Miami. Type them down below, or answer that question I just posed to you. Why did Miami, use the strategy they did in the portal? Do they trust their new lines of scrimmage that much? Should they trust their new lines of scrimmage that much? This team was a team that had a ridiculous amount of good matchups last season. They, because of their number 1 lines of scrimmage, matched up with pretty much everyone well. But they lacked in other areas, and those areas killed them. So they were not the most disciplined team last year. They had a quarterback in Beck who struggled reading zone coverage. They had a linebacker core that was pretty poor at tackling. But secondary was good. D-line was insane at getting to the QB. You could not get a TFL against that O-line. You could only stuff them at best. At worst, they'd get downfield, and then you'd give up a, big run. This past season, cemented in my mind that Cristobal is probably an underrated coach, and we should at least give him some benefit of the doubt. Certainly for building a program, but even for game planning. In-game management, I don't know, but the game plans they came up with against Ohio State, where they neutered Ohio State's tempo and aggressiveness immediately by just full court pressing them and not playing scared and being aggressive. What they did against A&M, that was impressive, just kind of daring Reed to beat them through the air. What they did against Indiana by going super wide with their techniques to just get past their tackles, that was impressive. I love Miami's future, but immediate future and long-term future are different. And reloading on the trenches is going to determine everything about this team. Why? Because that's the identity that Cristobal has formed with the Hurricanes. People last year, my friend Dylan, Ohio State DG on Twitter, shout out to him, Josh Pate, who one day hopefully we'll have on the show, and many others, David Polak, they accurately pointed out this team's different. This team has a level of size and twitchiness on the lines of scrimmage that no one else has. And I mistakenly at times doubted that, for sure. I did. I undervalued it against Indiana. I undervalued it against Ohio State. I did properly value the lines of scrimmage edge against Ole Miss and A&M, but I didn't quite quantify it. It was so important to their success last year. Where, say, if they have the lines of scrimmage of any other Hurricane team under Cristobal, they probably don't even make the playoffs. They probably lose those 2 games they ended up losing, and they probably lose to Notre Dame. Let's be honest about that, with how good that Notre Dame team was in power ratings and some of Miami's issues they had offensively throughout the season, even with a fantastic O-line. If they take a significant step back in that area, even if Mensah is far better than Beck, and even if every other position is far better than it was last year, because of how they are and their identity and how Heatherman's scheme does rely on D-line above all else, they will take a step back. Even if maybe overall from a roster angle they're better, if they're better at every other position except for lines of scrimmage and they're worse there, this will be a worse team due to their identity and how they want to play ball and what they're used to doing, what they want to do. So that's a huge question. And that isn't guaranteed. Lines of scrimmage could come close to reloading. I think no matter what, they're going to get worse with just how much they're losing. But I do think the D-line will still be pretty damn good. I think the O-line at the end of the year will at least be good, maybe even great. Although it's tough when you're possibly starting a freshman. But I think Mirabal is the best O-line coach in America or close to it right now. But Mensah is not guaranteed to be better than Beck. I think he is, but that's just what I think. It doesn't mean I'm right. Mensah, I think, was in a worse situation at Duke. He had no defense. He had a worse O-line. He had a worse supporting cast. And he put up really good numbers. He's basically in a shootout every day. I do think Mensah has a higher ceiling and is probably more of an NFL player than Beck is. But he may not work out in that same system where a lot of it last year, it was effective by like short passes, dink and dunk, getting guys out in space pretty early, a lot of screens, a lot of really like toxic game control, which is just nauseating to opposing defenses. You ugly it up. And not a lot of teams Miami played last year outside of really Indiana wanted to ugly it up. Ole Miss wanted to make it a shootout, and they nearly did, and Miami's talent was able to still win the day. A&M wanted that to be a finesse game, and the wind ruined it, and some of Miami's bad decisions kept A&M in the game longer than they should have been. Ohio State did not want to make that ugly. They wanted to go tempo early. Well, the O-line was just so bad on that given day that when they went tempo, missed assignment, or you're not strong enough against Miami's D-line, and, well, Sain's like 10 yards behind the line of scrimmage on the ground, and Miami wins the field position battle and gets a pick six off of the pressure, and Ohio State trying to alleviate that. The point being, the way Miami played last year was very, very much centered on their lines of scrimmage edge over everyone they played. And they're probably going to have to make significant changes, at least in my mind, with this new setup, at least initially, for them to have close to the level of success they did last year. So, for example, if the O-line in general is going to be a bit weaker in pass blocking, and I would expect it to be, if they're going to allow more TFLs, because they're not going to be as big as they were last year, they will probably still do that like tight O-line formation, which what that does is it minimizes TFLs, but also you don't have as many holes on the inside. So that's like that you're trading explosiveness for guaranteeing you're ahead of the chains, or at least you're not creating a busted drive. Maybe you need more explosive runs this year when you bring back all your running backs, and you might have better skill position players, but you're lacking a bit on the O-line. Maybe some more explosive runs can compensate for that. Or maybe, looking at defensively, now that you don't have the same pass rush and you need to be more of a defense that relies on more consistent stops rather than trying to constantly set people behind the chains, maybe you tackle better. Maybe you don't let people get to the second level. That was interesting with Miami last year. Is Indiana and Ohio State, and Ole Miss too, all teams who talent-wise should not have fantastic rushing offenses. Just like looking at what they had last year. Indiana did. Part of that was scheme, part of that's because their run blocking O-line was fantastic. Ohio State had an elite running back. Their run blocking was not good. Ole Miss, pretty mediocre O-line, good enough combined with Lacey and Chambliss to cause issues. In those games, Miami so often was able to stop running backs at the line of scrimmage for a loss or get to the quarterback. But if you could get past their D-line for a second, their linebackers or safeties were nowhere to be found, and if they were, they couldn't tackle you. And you'd get to the second level, and you'd have a big gain. That was why, on top of the blocked punt, Indiana beat Miami. Because they had just enough runs that got to the second level to extend drives, keep the ball in Miami's hands enough, and prevent Miami from ever taking a lead. It's also why Ohio State would have won if not for the pick six. Eventually, they were able to bust some runs that got to the second level. It created a balanced attack. It's why they dominated that second half right up until that final Miami drive. But stuff happens. And then the pass defense. That secondary, I loved their corners, but they weren't quite elite last year. They were close, though. Safeties were questionable in the sense that they weren't top end, but again, they were close. I think the secondary this year will be much better. But it's still a question. Like, how much of that secondary playing well last year was due to quarterbacks always being under duress, and how much of it was them actually being good? We'll see. But those are the questions I have for Miami. I will be honest to Hurricane fans here. Maybe this isn't good for views or something. I do have questions about the Hurricane squad this year. Do think they'll be a top 10 team. Do think they'll be in the college football playoff as of right now. But I do have my questions, and let me know down below if you have any, or if you want to answer any of my questions. Next up, we have Wisconsin, and whether or not I was too harsh on them in my predictions. That's going to be interesting for sure. So, how do I put this? How do I want to go about this? That's actually probably the better question to ask. Was I too harsh on Wisconsin in my Big Ten predictions, where I picked them to only win, I think it was 3 games. I picked them to go 3-9. Was I too harsh? I understand that their win total's at 6.5. I understand that there is some optimism among Wisconsin fans, but I want you guys to hear me out on my logic behind that, and then we can talk more about the optimistic side and maybe why I was wrong. Wisconsin does have an easy schedule, but their program is also shaky. They just lost their AD, they don't have a president right now, and their coach is on the hot seat. These are not good things. They're not good things. In no way is that good. And while their win total's at 6.5, I want to implore the idea with you guys that Wisconsin is the easiest schedule in the Big Ten outside of Penn State. Those are the 2 easiest, and trust me, they're the easiest by a mile. Wisconsin and Penn State basically have ACC schedules or Big 12 schedules. They do not have Big 10 and SEC schedules like the rest of the SEC, outside of maybe Georgia, depending on how good Alabama is. If they really fall off, Georgia's may also be ACC caliber or close. And, the rest of the SEC and Big 10 outside of Wisconsin, Penn State, maybe Georgia, have just this gauntlet. LSU could also be there with Georgia too, but we're talking about Wisconsin. Wisconsin is one of these schools in the Power 2 that doesn't actually have a Power 2 schedule. So their win total of 6.5 is like a 6.5 win total in the Big 12 or the ACC. Again, we'll get to the positives in a minute. I like to save the best for last. But on one hand, I think that my argument of, look, they get blown out by Notre Dame, in which they're an 18.5-point underdog, and say they lose to Penn State big on the road, they're 2-2 entering October with 2 blowout losses. That could demoralize a team. That could kind of, kick their knee in, hyperextend their knee, and all their knees torn up, and they're just done for the year. And then whether they beat Michigan State or not off the bye, like traveling to UCLA is going to be hard. And USC is not easy. Iowa has owned Wisconsin pretty much every year since 2022. So I think while there is an argument for me being too low on them, because I'm picking them to win 3.5 fewer games than their win total, if you're a Wisconsin fan, you have to understand this is a very precarious situation for your program. Very much so. Where, yes, your schedule's easy. It's much easier than it was last year. Like, no one's going to be as good on your schedule as Ohio State or Indiana were last year. Notre Dame this coming year might just be as good as Oregon was last year, though they could also be better. However, that doesn't mean that a team that, let's look at some game on paper numbers offensively. So Wisconsin last year was 121st in opponent adjusted EPA per play. So even adjusting for their tough schedule, they were they were a bad team by Power 4 standards. They were like an average FBS team last year. Very, very bad in terms of just being a team last year at a Big Ten level. When you look at rushing success rate, Wisconsin was 115th with only a 37.5% rushing success rate. Factoring out sacks, they only averaged 4.06 yards per carry, and that was a whopping... Oh, no, it was actually 4.56, my apologies. But still, that's pretty bad without sacks. 102nd in America. They could not throw the ball for crap. They could not protect the quarterback for crap. They had another injury. I when I look at it, I think there's a lot of logic behind the idea that, hey, I think Fickell's a good coach. I think Tressel's a good DC. I think Eric Mateos is probably one of the better O-line coaches in America. I will tell you guys right now, I probably will upgrade my Wisconsin prediction. In fact, I actually will say I probably definitely will, because I don't think Michigan State's roster even holds a candle to theirs. MSU's roster is that bad. So I definitely will be giving them at least an extra win, if not probably 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5. But understand this, and this is where we'll get to the positives. This team could go 8-4. They could go 9-3. And they could do so without being a top 25 team. Very easily. Because no team on the schedule outside of USC, Penn State, and Notre Dame have win totals above 8.5. None of them do. When I look at Wisconsin's depth chart here, just pulling it up, live research, I know they have Colton Joseph. I love Colton Joseph. But their offensive linemen, Kevin Haywood, P.J. Wilkins, Austin Kowicki, Colin Cubberly, Emerson Mandel, lot of transfers in there. That receiver room lost their best receivers in Vinny Anthony and Tresh Kekahuna. Chris Brooks Jr., Tyrell Henry, Eugene Hilton, they're not special, at least from what we saw last year. Now, to be fair, they didn't have anyone throwing them the football, so maybe one of them is. Quarterback room is going to be much better than it was last year. You know, Colton Joseph, Carter Smith with another year of development should be better. I do like the running back room with Abu Sama and Brian Jackson II, and I do like the defense. So, like, as I'm telling you this and even justifying me probably being too low on Wisconsin, I'm telling you right now, I do view them as a better team than I did a few weeks ago or a few months ago, and that will be reflected in my post-spring Big Ten predictions. Trust me, that will be reflected there. But understand that with a coach on the hot seat, a shaky program that has no identity, Chris McIntosh was an absolute failure as an AD. Predicting Fickell to get fired in the middle of the year isn't all that bold when you factor in that with this schedule, going 7-5 means that with anyone else's schedule in the Big Ten except for Penn State's, you go 5-7. They have to win 8 or 9 games this year for them to be any juice or momentum moving forward. There has to be. They will not be a top 25 team or even close unless they win 8 or 9 games. That 6.5 win total is more like Nebraska's win total being at 6.5 now, while Wisconsin's is the books telling you that they think Nebraska's going to be significantly better than Wisconsin. That's what the books are saying. Just as an example there. So Wisconsin, the path for a breakout year, let's talk about that briefly. That would be Colton Joseph being a top 25 quarterback, which I think he will be. But more importantly than that, it's that Eric Mateos immediately has an impact on the offensive line in a huge way. And they do a better job getting downfield. They're able to do a much better job at, pass blocking. The transfers pan out. They have enough at tight end and receiver and enough at running back where they can, run what Jeff Grimes loves to do, which is a power spread. I think that actually fits Eric Mateos and what, he did with Sam Pittman at Arkansas pretty well, because Bobby Petrino historically likes to run a power spread. And they can have a really good rushing attack with a good enough passing attack. And that combined with Mason Posa and Cooper Catalano taking a step forward and the transfers on defense panning out means you could have a top 25 or even top 20 team. There is a path there, and I think it is somewhat realistic. But that's also looking at the best possible outcome. The worst possible outcome is Fickell, gets depantsed in the middle of the year because not all those portal additions pan out. And it is asking a lot of this staff to not bring in anyone who is viewed as special by recruiting services or other staffs and to have scouted them all. That is asking a lot. So for Wisconsin, am I too low on them? I don't know. Intuitively, on paper, I definitely am. And I think I'm going to adjust for that because, they're a lower end team right now. So, if I end up being too high on them by adjusting, If I do that, well, then oh well. It's not like they're going to win it all or anything. I highly doubt they'll even make the playoffs. But understand that it has not gone well at Wisconsin. And for there to be a 3 bad years with Fickell right now, you've lost a lot of momentum. So they have to really pull the nose up, Wisconsin does this year, and not just, win 7 games. But if you want real momentum for Fickell, you want buy-in, you want them to be a top spender and for everything to flip, win 9 or 10 games. And I feel like it's more likely Fickell gets fired than that happens. Finally, a report card on Brent Venables. How well has Oklahoma performed under Brent Venables? This is a new series we're doing. It's called the Coaching Report Card. Just think it's a fun thing to do. And first coach I want to grade is Brent Venables, entering his 5th year. Venables had a rough start at 6-7, and then broke out, went 10-3, and there was a point in 2023 where people thought Oklahoma would win the Big 12 and reach the college football playoff. They then lost to Kansas and Oklahoma State, went 10-2, then lost the bowl game to Arizona where Jackson Arnold was showcased. In that game, we all saw Jackson Arnold and his arm talent. I was not sold the minute I watched that game, and I ended up being right there. I ended up being right. But the following year, Oklahoma actually exceeded everyone's expectations, my own included, and they went 10-2. They won close games. They played excellent defense. Mateer was enough offensively with a young but passionate, strong offensive line to get the job done. And then they lost in the first round against Alabama in the college football playoff at home. So 6-7, 10-3, 6-7, 10-3. For a 32-20 record, winning over 60% of his games. He has 1 win against Texas. He's 1-3 there. And against Oklahoma State, I know that in 2023, that game doesn't really matter. He lost to him in 23. That mattered a lot more than the 2022 game. And Texas at this point is pretty much Oklahoma's only rival now. Oklahoma, when I think of them right now, I think of a great program that historically was elite, but is still finding its way through the river to get to the other side. And I don't know if they're going to get there before the current attempt, the current person carrying, the brand, carrying the family creed, or carrying, the name of Oklahoma is going to get there before they drown. A metaphor for getting there before they get fired. I don't know. So I think definitely not an A+, but definitely not an F. He wins too many games. He said too many games that are wins due to coaching, like the win against Texas in 2023, the wins against Alabama in 24 and 25, the wins over Auburn and Michigan last year. A lot of the close wins they had last year, a lot of that was due to good coaching, more so than luck, I would argue. And they've done well in the portal, and they've done well evaluating their roster, I think, and developing overall. So again, not an A+, but not an F either. Let's take a deeper look here at the trends. When you look at Oklahoma on a 5-year trend, which still includes Riley for now, this time next year when we regrade some of these coaches, you won't have to see that guy's name, because I know OU fans don't like Riley, and I completely get why. That was just a massive change and a mass exodus of the roster that he inflicted on them. So you see double-digit wins, 6 wins, double-digit wins below 500, double-digit wins. It's kind of this zigzag pattern. The recruiting has never been top 5 really at Oklahoma, never was under Riley, was under Venables for a few seasons, but the past 2 seasons it's dipped to be fringe top 15. That doesn't help their prospects, but if they nail their portal additions, that also can compensate for it. Venables' best team was in 2023. That was the best offense he's ever had by a long shot, and the defense, while not as good as the 24 or 25 units, was closer to those units than the 24 or 25 offenses were to the 2023 offenses. And look, I mean, Oklahoma's preseason win total is sitting at 7.5, and their schedule is super duper tough. But the books are also probably telling you we don't know if this is a national title contender, even with all that they return. They bring back Mateer, much of the O-line. They bring back their best receiver and some guys from the portal. Really, where they lack in production is defense, and I would give Venables benefit of the doubt there. It's not good that they've had inconsistent up and down years, but you also have to think that, look, if his worst season is going to a bowl game where, those 2 seasons where they went below 500 were a first year of a rebuilding year, and in 2024 they had a gauntlet of an SEC schedule, well, he can't be an awful coach if that's his worst year, especially since he had to rebuild after Riley kind of only left him the defense and took everything else. I mean, he built that defense into being a power, and in 23 he had a great offense, and in 25 it was serviceable enough and should be better this year. So now I'm thinking you can't grade him in the D range, but I don't think you can grade him in the A range either. Let's move on and move past the trends and his overall record and things as a head coach, and look at more specifically what the team was last year, because we don't care as much about 22, 23, or 24 as we do last year. This Oklahoma team was a good team bordering on great. And what made them actually exciting to watch, I usually don't like to watch teams that really struggle to run the ball the way Oklahoma does. But there's something entertaining about teams that play elite defense and just find ways to win. And that's what Oklahoma did. They were 10th in game control because their defense was fantastic. They made good in-game decisions. Mateer gave them enough of a run game and pass game to move the chains. They had some big plays when needed, both offensively and defensively, and their special teams were phenomenal. There's a reason they beat Alabama. There's a reason why they beat, let's live research here. ESPN's FPI. Looking at Oklahoma, they were 15th in FPI. They were able to beat Alabama, who was 10th. They were able to beat Michigan, who was 20th, Tennessee, who was 19th. I know they also lost to Alabama, and to be fair, they lost to Texas. They beat Auburn, who was 24th in FPI, Missouri, who was 22nd. They got a lot of good power rating wins. They did. And in a lot of games where, look, they were close. They were by the margins, and it was due to decision-making or due to having the better players that they developed that they came out on top in. So when factoring in that, Oklahoma really, when Venables was on the hot seat, exceeded expectations, they rebounded, they have a really good recruiting class for 2027. I think they did a good job with their portal evals both last year and this year. I don't think, by the way, Mateer is a great quarterback. I think at best he's good. He doesn't really have an NFL future, but that was an upgrade and a better eval compared to what they had over Arnold, and the hiring of Ben Arbuckle was a good move at OC. If I had to give Venables a grade right now, entering a season where, look, the win total's at 7.5, but it is a tough schedule. You got to play Texas neutral field still, and you got to play Missouri on the road. You got to play Michigan on the road. You hosted those teams last year. You get a road trip to Georgia. You get a road trip to Florida. Honestly, this schedule's going to be tougher than it was last year, because a lot of the teams like Michigan, Auburn, Missouri, LSU that many expected to be tough last year, even Texas, disappointed. The only team on Oklahoma's schedule last year that really exceeded expectations was Ole Miss. That was it. Everyone else pretty much disappointed relative to what people had them in the preseason. This year I got a feeling that Michigan, Georgia, Florida, Texas, pretty much everyone on the schedule except for A&M and maybe Ole Miss and South Carolina will be better than what the public thinks and what most think. So the program, is it elite? No. Is it bad? No. Is it closer to being above the 50th percentile than below? Yes. So I would give Venables right now a B grade as a coach. And I think that the key for him is just finding a way to beat Texas and making sure that his floor is more so 7 or 8 wins rather than 6 wins, which is very, very difficult. If he's not able to get to that, the odds are that at some point he's going to get fired, even if he does win playoff games and he has good seasons. But I'd give him a B grade right now, and I do like what Oklahoma has entering the 2026 season. That's it, guys. Thank you for watching. I know the show ran long, but I have all the energy in the world. I do not feel burned out whatsoever. Again, bit of a longer show, but I thought we were going to go for 2 hours or a little bit over than today anyway. We did end up going 50 minutes over, but look at all the concurrent viewers we have. Look at all you guys on here. We will be back at you tomorrow for a live show. Hopefully one that will be shorter than this, but one that will probably be around, I'm going to say an hour 30 or 2 hours. Let me check. I ended the recording, so that will be up on Spotify today. Videos will be up either tonight or first thing tomorrow morning from this segment. Tomorrow, what do we have here? A lot more of shorter topics. We have my mock draft. We have more big questions for teams. We have 2 additional topic videos, and we'll be reviewing my worst and best predictions for 2025. It will be a shorter segment for sure. There just won't be as many players or won't be as much to talk about. So thank you so much, guys. Good to be back. See you guys tomorrow. Love y'all. Let me read some comments before I get out of here. Appreciate it, Sam. Go Buckeyes. Thank you, Pist Ohioan, for being a moderator. I raise this chalice of supremacy to you and say, go Buckeyes to you. Anyone else? Let me see. Oklahoma should be in the Big Ten, Rudy the Boxer 101 says. That's an interesting comment. And so it's interesting, Oklahoma and Texas are rivals, and they're very geographically close, but culturally they're very different. Oklahoma definitely feels like definitely more like a Big Ten or even Big 12 team than Texas. Like, Texas moving to the SEC makes sense when you think about how the move did benefit A&M in a way, and how Texas, it is very urban. Football is like a god, a religion in Texas. And just with the donors and the whole NIL thing and the large fan base, it makes sense. Oklahoma's fan base is not nearly as big. So as a content creator, I have to research the largest fan bases, because unless a team is super, super good, I'm not going to target them if they have a small fan base. Even Indiana, who is really, really good now and had a small fan base, their alumni size is the biggest in the world. So if they continue to be this good, they're eventually going to have one of the best fan bases in college football. They'll eventually have one of the largest. Oklahoma, when you look at SEO trends and search results, they have one of the biggest fan bases in football. It's not nearly as big as a lot of SEC or Big Ten fan bases, though. Their culture around football, they're very passionate. They have high expectations, but it's just, it's different. It's not inferior to Texas, but it's different culturally. And I do have this worry that, if Venables can't beat Sark, that move of Oklahoma to the SEC might really end up, that could kill their program. That could really kill their program. So that's an interesting comment, Rudy the Boxer. Thank you for that. Really appreciate it. Anyway, guys, I got to get going. I got to leave for class in 15, 20 minutes. I will be graduating in May, so that should help the schedule be more consistent, because that basically will free up anywhere from 10 to 20 hours a week from me, and probably a few additional hours of mental exhaustion where I have to flip, okay, done with school, now I gotta work.